Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the continuation of the hearing on submissions on Dunedin's draft future development strategy, and we're going to commence proceedings this afternoon with the karakia.
Kia ora koutou, nia haku mihi ki koutou. He maumahara ko ka matu whatakatia. Me te au ko hatu ki nei wā. Hari atu rā ki e tātou tokora. A roko o te kaupapa o te rānei. He uri tēnā o karatai mei ka hapu maha o tākau he mihi anō. So that's just a welcome from those that came before us, wishing us well with our deliberations today. Kia ora.
Thank you, Huani. Just before we hear from our first submitter, anything from the officers this morning or this afternoon for us? So we've received further information as requested last week from Preen's Dry Cleaning, Kainga Ora and Somerset. So Jenny, if you could just thank those parties on our behalf for providing that information in a timely manner, which is appreciated. And just before I forget, before we turn to our first submitter, just in relation to the Somerset information, I've just got a couple of questions for the staff. Now, Tom Calvin from Somerset provided us with an estimate of what he thinks is required for the retirement sector going 30 years out, but he put the information in terms of hectares. So the question I have, could staff take the greenfield capacity numbers from table 15 of the HCA and just let me know or let us know what that would be in hectares? And then the other question is, does table 15, the greenfields line in the HCA, does that include all of the existing greenfields and existing residential transition overlay zone areas that appear in figure 26 of the draft FDS? And yeah, figure 26. And just the third question is, are there any other existing residential transition overlay zones relating to greenfield that aren't in figure 26? So just help complete that picture for me. Now, do any other panel members have any other questions arising, questions of clarification from the information that was submitted by those three parties? No? No. Excellent. All right, so now we turn to our first submitter, which is Southern Edge Hub Farms Limited. Good morning and welcome, and we're very happy for you to introduce yourselves to us in a moment. But just to let you know, like I've let all the submitters know, first of all, to thank you for providing all of your pre-circulated information, evidence and legal submissions on time, which was appreciated. And we've read that information, so none of it needs to be read out loud to us, which you're probably pleased to know. But everyone who's provided information is very welcome to highlight key points for us, and no doubt we'll have questions for you. But other than that, Mr. Page, over to you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, panel members. My name's Phil Page, and together with Bridget Irving, the two of us counsel for Southern Edge today. To my immediate left is Peter Dines, whose evidence you should have as two briefs, a brief of evidence in chief and a rebuttal brief as well. And next to Pete is John Kyle, who's going to give you the planning evidence, and he's likewise has filed two briefs. We assumed that none of us would be reading anything to you this afternoon, and so we may be rather shorter than the original 1.5 hours that has been estimated and allocated, and we're grateful for that time. But I've encouraged Pete to engage with all of you extensively on the subject of logistics. Pete has tried to teach me about logistics over the last several weeks. He thinks it's common sense, and I tried to explain to Pete that it might make sense, but it may not be common. Anyway, it's common to Pete, so questions about logistics, how trucks work, where they go, how they interrelate with the rail network and the port, are all best directed to him and certainly not to me. So what I plan to do in terms of legal submissions is to very briefly hit some of the highlight issues that we've raised in the submissions and respond to the recommendations in the report. Bridget will work through the drafting changes that have been recommended and indicate to you the extent to which we either accept or suggest something different. to those in the drafting detail, and at that point then I will hand over to Pete to present a video which has been pre-circulated. We'd like to play it again, and that will perhaps be an aide-memoire about the kinds of questions about how does a logistics park actually work, and why does that mean that the particular location adjacent to Duke's Road is by far and away the best site for that kind of business. So that's how we plan to run it. I'm happy to take questions at any point. People have different styles as to whether they want to wait to the end or to ask questions as occurs to them. I'm happy with either way. I'm conscious that sometimes people forget the questions they want to ask if you wait to the end.
So, Mr. Page, just in terms of that, I trust people's memories, and my preference is for us to hear each speaker to finish speaking, and then we'll whip around the panel and ask questions from each speaker after that.
In your hands, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
So the overarching theme in the legal submissions that Bridget and I prepared is really addressing what the function of a future development strategy is under the NPSUD, and in particular the use of the word how in the NPSUD. What it requires is for a long-term strategic to promote long-term strategic planning by setting out how a local authority intends to do certain things. So our point is really answering the how question isn't simply to restate an objective that has been identified in prior strategic documents. An FDS has to take that one step further and explain how the councils are going to do that, and that how has to be explained spatially. And so that is why in the submissions that we lodged originally, we asked for the logistics hub area to be mapped in the FDS, because we submit that that's actually a requirement of the FDS under the NPSUD. Happily, the staff recommendation have accepted that mapping is appropriate for a future logistics hub area. And so we all now seem to be at item with that, and I see that Mr. Garbutt's submissions accept that that is so. And so really, so far as your staff recommendation and Southern Edge's position is, fundamentally what we want to achieve this afternoon is to discourage you from accepting the advice that the logistics hub has to be subject to things. All right, so and by that I mean if we go to the page 104 of the recommending report, at paragraph 193, what the recommendation is that it recommended that if the panel supports the submission, the area is added to the FDS as a potential future location for an in-net report, subject to necessary investigations and infrastructure upgrades, etc., etc. And it sets out three things: 3 waters upgrades, a heavy vehicle bypass, and necessary upgrades to flood management infrastructure. Now, our submission to you is that is not an appropriate function of an FDS. It is appropriate to identify the constraints, and it is appropriate to map constraints, but it is not appropriate to make things subject to them. How those constraints are managed, how they are overcome, is for a future process. That process might be a change to a district plan, for example, and at that point, that's how you figure out, okay, we've got a flood hazard, how do we deal with that? Okay, we've got a transport assessment that says certain things about the capacity of certain roads or intersections, that's fine. How do we resolve that? That's where the question about how the constraints are resolved or addressed or not resolved needs to be tackled. My submission to you is that you shouldn't be tempted through the preparation of an FTS to say that one thing is subject to another, because that's not your job, that's for another panel on another day. So I'm happy that this FDS identifies the constraints that the staff have identified. That's fine. What we're not happy with is the recommendation that the mapping be somehow expressed as being subject to them. So that's really the high theme that we want to address today. I want to respond briefly to Mr. Garbutt's legal submissions. At paragraph 41, he takes issue with the use of my expression, getting out of the way. Those were my words. What I meant by that was that the FDS in its notified form indicated support for the idea of a logistics hub, but after a whole bunch of feasibility studies had been completed. Now, the getting out of the way comment in my submissions at paragraph 32 or 33 or whatever it was, is a reference to everything being held up until yet more feasibility studies have been done. It's been at least 10 years since the first strategic document adopted by the ORC has identified the need for an inland port, as those documents referred to it as. We already know about that. What Pete doesn't need you to do is to tell him whether that's feasible or not. It's his money he's spending. So what we're saying to you is that your job through the FDS is to identify the location to provide for that, how that gets done, whether it's feasible or not, how it is served. That is a task for Pete and his fellow investors to work out for themselves. Perhaps the one thing that has probably been central in the minds of the drafting is in relation to the heavy traffic bypass. Southern Edge's position on the heavy traffic bypass is that has been identified as a priority for 20 years now. Sooner or later, something will get done about that. Riccarton Road was designated for a heavy traffic bypass 10 years ago, and then that designation was allowed to lapse by NZTA. I don't know why. But the proposition from Southern Edge is that that is for the transport authorities and their function to deal with. It is not something that the identification of the logistics hub should be addressing directly. We've got a state highway that can serve the site. Whether there are better alternatives or not is for others to determine. The evidence that Pete has filed, and he can explain, is that for the first phase of the development of the logistics hub, we're not expecting to see an increase in trucks using the state highway network, and he can explain why that is. But I've listened into the evidence given by Andrew Sims for the community board last week, and it seemed that his view was that, well, we need to actually get this project up and going, and that will be the stimulus for having the heavy traffic bypass issue determined if it needs to be. And that aligns with Southern Edge's view of those issues. All right, so that's all I wanted to say in terms of the high-level stuff that we wanted to deal with. Bridget's going to address you on the recommended drafting changes to the FDS itself.
Yeah.
I don't think you've got some evidence, I just need to check.
Okay, what is it?
Peter Dines, can't see it in. I've got it, but you have to tell I've got it.
Yeah, we got it.
We've got two bits, one's on Squiz and one's on email.
So you've got it?
Pretty sure.
We could be done. Okay. And it's not on the 2 pages.
So what are you missing, Emma?
The first one's on Squiz.
So, Mr. Page, the issue is Jenny is just checking if we've received all of Mr. Dines' evidence. So, I have rebuttal evidence dated 28 March. Is that the latest one?
Can someone perhaps find that?
Okay, does panel members got that? Yeah. All right, so it looks like the panel's got it and staff will be provided with a copy of it. So, Mr. Page, just before you hand to Ms. Irvine, I'll just see if we have any questions for you in terms of your high-level overview of the legal issues. Andrew, any questions for Mr. Page at this stage in terms of the high-level
Because
issues?
I'm a dinosaur and I'm still working off hard copies, I was just trying to identify the date that Jenny sent the email with Peter's evidence, that was all.
Right.
And John's evidence.
I'll resend it to you now.
Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Page? And turn your mic on, Andrew, sorry. Great.
Slow start, sorry. So the question relates to Mr. Garbutt's evidence. Basically, your point, Phil, I'll go first names because it's so much easier. Your point around getting out of the way and just understanding there would still be overlap to a certain degree with some investigation work around public infrastructure, for example. So there will be still a degree of collaboration required at some point further down the track.
Yes, it is. It's a question about where and when is the right time for that to occur, which is kind of where John's evidence is directed to, because the extent to which additional public infrastructure might be required to serve the logistics hub site is something that would typically be addressed at plan change stage. The function of the FDS is to identify the constraints now, and that as a subsequent process, how the council's own financial planning cycles engage with that, or whether it engages with that, or whether that leaves the problem up to the developer to resolve, that's a decision subsequent.
My second question relates to Michael's evidence as well, and he alludes to potentially identification of a larger area rather than this particular site relating to this submission. Have you got any view or comment?
We're more than happy for a larger area than what has been sought in the submission to be identified. We understand the reason why that has been recommended and are okay with it. For his part, Pete can explain why he thinks that the site that Southern Edge has actually purchased is by far superior from a logistics development point of view. But if the FDS, or if you making decisions for the FDS want to include a wider area of that, just in case some of the constraints may prove problematic, or others may wish to acquire land for a similar purpose, we don't have an antagonistic position to that.
Thank you, and Bridget might pick this up. I'm just trying to get it clear in my mind when you said that the FDS shouldn't say that the site is subject to, but you're happy for the site to identify what the constraints are. So I'm thinking maybe, Bridget, you're going to pick it up in your suggested wording changes. I mean, we can leave, if you are, I mean, we can just leave it till then.
I probably wasn't going to respond specifically to that recommendation because there's no drafting changes that address that specifically. Do you want to tackle it, Phil? Do you want me to? Yeah, I mean, I think that we're saying identify the constraints so that they'll need to be resolved. But what we're not saying is put the resolution of those ahead of the development of the logistics park. Yeah.
Thank you. And my other question, and Pete might answer this, you said in terms of the heavy traffic bypass that the first phase of the hub, there won't be increased traffic. I'm just wondering how long that is envisaged that first phase might be.
Approximately 5 years.
No, and I presume leaving bypass and alternate locations and those types of things is better held to the end of their presentation. Then I'm good for the moment.
Yes, just specifically to this how question, and in terms of feasibility studies and other such things, I think I can agree with you that for a business feasibility study, those who are executing the activity probably would be the ones who are best to understand that. But what about a transport feasibility study? And I guess some questions I'm going to ask later, it'll come later, but it relates to this question. Is this a port for export or import? Will it handle logs? Will it only be containers? If it's for import, what will the vehicle movements be for the distribution of the imported material? Those are the kind of things that go into a traffic planning report. And I guess my feeling is when people were talking about feasibility studies, I think that's what they were talking about. Would you think it's wise to go ahead without the answers to those questions in any detail?
Well, what I'll do is defer to Pete the freight mix and import versus export and all the rest of that stuff. But in terms of feasibility, my answer is still no, because we know that as part of a rezoning or consent proposal that an integrated transport assessment is going to be necessary. It may well be that other agencies such as Waka Kotahi wish to proceed with their own strategic planning around heavy traffic bypass, which has been signalled as a priority in this city for 20 years, but that's not for this submitter or this developer to do. That's a public transport network issue. So my submission to you is that it doesn't make sense to hold up the logistics park while other organisations may or may not carry out feasibility studies for projects that they may or may not be interested in pursuing. Sooner or later you've got to explain where the logistics park may appropriately be, and then how those constraints get resolved, and heavy transport logistics is just one of those constraints. It may fall for another day. It may, for example, be the case that actually railing the freight into site substantially resolves some of those issues and doesn't require investment by Waka Kotahi. We don't know, because the mix of the solutions hasn't yet been determined, and this isn't the forum for doing that.
So we should go ahead then, in your opinion, and identify this site without any surety that it could get a consent later, without taking into account its probability of getting consented?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do think that. For all the reasons that Pete explained in his original evidence about why the site is the most appropriate location for a logistics hub.
If we identify, and it has been identified early on, and agree to a freight logistics hub in the southern region of the city, does that in any way then preclude this going forward? But if no particular site's named, would that preclude this going forward then with a consent request saying that it's consistent with what the FDS direction is?
If a site wasn't identified, would it preclude a consent coming forward for the site? No, it wouldn't preclude it, but it would be a significant step forward in terms of getting through the NPS HPL gateways for sites that are highly productive land, which is one of the constraints on this site, for it to be specifically identified in the FDS as being the logistics hub site.
So I'm going to actually ask Mr. Garbutt to probably help us out with some advice on this question then afterwards. Your statement says then that it would help it if it went forward, so isn't that then already starting to move it down the consent path? That's my question really.
Not the consent path, it helps move it down the strategic planning path. And so, for example, if it is the case that additional, say, transportation investments part of the mix, then how does anybody plan for it if we don't know what site's been identified? I mean, that's part of the function of an FDS, is to enable those who invest in infrastructure to be able to plan for what's coming.
Well, and I'll take basically our FDS on three waters and identification of water treatment plants required, sewer treatment plants required in the northern part of the city. So the identification of the need for those plants has been seen, and the plants that are existing have been named and are considered to be, but the actual site of the new plant has not been identified. So how is this consistent or inconsistent with the concept that if a freight hub is identified as being to the south of the city in an appropriate manner, and also depending on the type of hub, proximity will matter a lot. How is that inconsistent with the way in which the the foul water treatment plants were treated in the north in the city?
The short answer is I simply don't know, because I don't know why sites for new treatment facilities north of the city, I guess we're talking about Waititi and Waikawaiti, so I don't know the reason for that. It may be that they're just not far enough through their own development planning to do that. I just don't know. Whereas what we know is that the investor who says I can deliver the logistics hub that the city's been planning for 20 years is sitting here and saying, well, this is my site and this is why, and I want to go.
Wouldn't that have resulted in Christchurch Airport building an airport at Terrace? Well, when we talk about the developer says that monetaristically they feel they can go and that's the only thing that we should be considering, I'm just wondering if other territorial authorities, when dealing with large transport infrastructures, have had to go by just the provider alone as the only source of saying it's a good idea.
Well, no, because it's not just the fact that Southern Edge Hubs has bought the land it says is appropriate. It's that they've explained to you in the evidence why the site's appropriate. And so even if they hadn't bought the land, they would still be here saying this is the appropriate site.
In our evidence, do we have expert transport evidence? Oh, thank you.
Any high-level legal questions there, Kate?
It is back to naming sites.
Mine are, I think, legal, quasi-legal. They may be planning, but I'm going to put them, and I'm really happy if this person, if Mr. Page doesn't answer them and he wants to defer to someone later. I appreciate that it's hard to know the difference sometimes until the questions are asked. My question is the suggestion that alternative sites have to be considered in order to get into the FDS, which is, I think, really, to a certain extent. Do you think that all alternative sites, and they may be within or without of Dunedin, have to be considered before? And that was one of the suggestions, I think, in the reporters' response. They're happy for it to go in, but there was a suggestion that alternative sites should have to be considered as well. And legally, is that a requirement, do you think, under the future development strategy?
No, there's nothing of that kind required of an FDS. The council, or the councils, through their development of the FDS, can identify sites if they consider that it will result in what the test is, achieve a well-functioning urban environment. That's what you're interested in. You don't have to positively exclude the idea that there may be alternatives for a logistics hub. Pete's got very firm views about whether there are alternatives, and I'd invite you to ask him about that. But I don't think you have to turn your mind to alternatives.
Thank you. And the only other question is, the alternative, is there an alternative way for this proposal and using designations? I mean, you mentioned your self-designations earlier, and it turned my mind to, is this a process that could be done through designation potentially?
Well, yeah. So we're a long way prior to that. Let's suppose for a moment that you do identify the site in the FDS as appropriate for a future logistics hub. How that then becomes reality, there are several planning process steps to go through to get from this point to actually boots on the ground. So a designation would be a possibility if a requiring authority had financial responsibility for the project. Pete's not a requiring authority, so that's technically not available to Southern Edge Hub Farms at this point in time. But there are other planning processes that may well be appropriate. But all of those processes, no matter which ones they are, will address I think Councillor O'Malley's question about integrated transport assessments and engineering design and things of that kind.
Mr. Page, just one question from me. Do you have a copy of the draft FDS available to you? Can you turn to page 80 of that, please? So page 80. Yeah. And that has a figure 29 on it. So my question is the approach you're asking us to take with regard to the freight hub similar to the approach that's been taken here with regard to business land? Namely, you're asking for the general identification, or in your case, a specific identification of a freight hub area, which could be similar to the those little circular or areas shown on figure 29 with constraints that exist being discussed in the narrative as they are for that new business land in the second paragraph of that page. Are you just asking us to take a similar approach here?
Yes, we are. Yeah, but I guess the difference is that this is a very specific kind of business land we're talking about. It has a specific purpose and role, and that's why we wanted it identified for that reason.
No, I understand that, but that's the kind of approach that you're asking us for. Okay. Ms. Irvine.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just thought it would be useful just to work through some of the recommended changes in the officer's report in response to some of the specific relief that we had sought in our submission in relation to particular provisions of the FDS. So starting at page 23 of the officer's report, we identified there that we sought a new strategic direction in relation to the development of an inland freight hub. We still think that given the significance of the proposal and the extent to which it touches on a wider range of strategic directions in the FDS, that a separate provision would be worthwhile. In relation to the drafting that has been recommended, it is broadly okay, but for its lack of reference to collaboration also occurring with freight logistics operators. I think as Pete has explained in his evidence and could certainly explain further, the movement of freight from where it's generated to port and where it lands at port and taken to people who use it is currently largely dealt with by private freight operators, and so they are a key part of the chain who should be included in that collaboration process.
Yep, sorry, and I might just interrupt you there, apologies for that. So before I start writing a whole lot of stuff down, I imagine you're going to provide a track changes document which refers to the page of the recommendation report, the wording recommended by the staff, and any amendments that you are now suggesting. Yeah,
certainly.
Yep, so we would need that by, well, midday tomorrow at the latest.
That's fine.
Yep, thanks.
So then moving on to page 50 of the officer's report. And this was adding a new key transport priority. So there's been general agreement that a new priority would be useful, and much of the text that we proposed has been accepted. Probably the last piece, which is over on page 50, which simply talks about studies currently being underway in inland port opportunities. You will see in the drafting that we've requested we take a somewhat more direct approach about needing to facilitate the development of that, and believe that providing that level of direction is more useful. And also, perhaps to touch on some of the questions from Councillor O'Malley, we point there to it being useful because of the work foreshadowed in the FDS around a strategic transport study for Mosgiel. And if that work is to be undertaken over that sort of 2024, 2027 type time period, having the site identified so that it is included in and that report considers the impact of a freight hub on the transport network around Mosgiel, we think would be really useful, rather than the freight hub potentially landing at some stage down the track and the strategic transport study needing to be entirely revised to accommodate it. Doesn't strike us as overly efficient. So then, moving on to page 110 of the officer's report, and we've suggested a further paragraph at 6.6.1, and that's largely been accepted with a few drafting changes, I think, which we are comfortable with. And then over at page 113 of the officer's report, we had sought some deletions and then additions to clause 6.7.4. I think the provisions there, the changes that we're suggesting and the ones that have been accepted, there's just potentially some inconsistencies if the parts of that provision that we suggested be deleted were to remain. And so we recommend just some changes to ensure there's consistency there. And then at 6.7.4, which is table 6, once again, and it's been accepted this time, there's reference to private freight operators being one of the stakeholders to be involved. Again, we think there should be more direct language about the works that would be undertaken there, as opposed to general discussion of feasibility work. And that is, so the last one, sorry, is on page 125 of the officer's report. And some of our drafting has been accepted. And the amendments that have been suggested, I think, are acceptable. We had effectively sought to hold space for the possibility that if Southern Edge were not to advance this proposal, that the FDS may like to contemplate steps beyond their work if they wanted to, or if the FDS needed to. Hence preserving that in the drafting that we had originally proposed. But I don't think Pete would be concerned if all eggs were placed in his basket, so to speak. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks for that outline of what you, on behalf of your submitter that you're representing, is happy with, and request that we give it some more thought, or the officers give it some more thought. And we look forward to getting those track changes from you. So I'll just see if we have any questions of clarification for you in terms of what you've just spoken about. Kate?
Not for wording. I do have a question for Mr. Dines when it's suitable, but I'm not quite, yeah.
No, that's right. We'll hear from him first.
Yeah.
Just that strikeout on page 113. Are you proposing to strike out the passing loop language in that?
Yeah, that was what we had suggested be deleted, because the feedback we'd received was that was an entirely accurate description. I think you've got Kiwi Rail's submission where they've recommended or made the point that while there isn't a passing loop, they've retained land capable of providing for that, hence that deletion. But if that deletion isn't accepted, I think there's just changes that need to be made around the time frames and so on that are referenced in there, so it's consistent with the balance of the relief that we've sought.
Thanks, because the passing loop was identified at a time when there was analysis done on extra train movements. Those extra train movements were commercial, were passenger, but they were but they were in fact extra train movements. So the issue would be, if that passing loop doesn't get built, will the extra train movements be able to also come out of this inland port? That's why I'm not too sure if it should come out at them.
Yeah, and I think Pete will be able to speak to that a little bit too, in terms of how that would work, shuttling backwards and forwards to the port.
So just in terms of that last point, I think you said in your verbal you were still seeking the deletion of some of that text that was shown and deleted in your change requested column. Can you then do two options for us? One, the obvious one, is still to delete those words as per your original submission, and secondly, if the words are retained, what further refinement of those words you think might be appropriate to address the issue that Councillor O'Malley raised?
Yes, certainly.
Yep, so give us two options there to think about.
Thank you. What I'll do is, Pete, if you could put your microphone on and introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Pete Dines from Dines Group. Thank you for letting me come and talk today.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you. Let's watch the video. Do we have that circulated?
But I'll get the technical person to do it.
Demand is put on the New Zealand freight network. Productivity and infrastructure deficiencies are eroding the supply chain, making freight transportation more challenging. Like every city with a shortage of industrial land, Dunedin and the southern region are facing challenges to find sustainable freight and transport solutions to meet future growth requirements. Today, over 350,000 tonnes of import-export products are moved by truck alone into Dunedin, stored throughout a local warehousing network and containerised for import-export into Otago, Southland and South Canterbury. These truck movements cover 1,160,000 kilometres, accounting for 4,800 tonnes of carbon dioxide annually. Better use of the transport network can significantly reduce CO2 emissions, but this requires a well-placed logistics facility with flat land and direct rail access. Our vision is to develop an inland logistics park to meet the increasing need for high-quality supply chain services in the southern region. After an extensive search, we have secured a 40-hectare site near Mosgiel with rail access. The proposed Southern Link Logistics Park will offer comprehensive support services from a single location, accessible via road and rail. This collaborative approach by Dines Transport Group and Port Otago is supported by existing Kiwi rail infrastructure to create a more efficient value supply chain. By containerising goods and using existing rail capacity to Port Otago, the logistics park takes trucks off the road and increases efficiency within the supply chain by reducing the routes travelled and speeding up the transfer of goods. The Southern Link Logistics Park is a world-class facility designed to optimise productivity and sustainable supply chain practices. This new facility will include warehousing, offering shared or multi-user facilities from 2,500 to 15,000 square metres per customer, capacity for ambient and chilled products, truck canopies and unloading docks, rail siding, including a staging pad for the loading and unloading of rail freight, a 5-hectare container terminal for storage of import and export containers, a 4-hectare container depot for maintenance and upgrades of import and export containers, a break bulk storage facility for the assembly and construction of non-containerised product, including the capability for a log marshalling yard. MPI and customs compliance for the import and export terminal and break bulk yard, with the capability of providing a customs bond store. Internal roadways for straddle carriers and reach stackers. A hydrogen fuel depot with a truck and fork hoist maintenance facility. Workforce housing and accommodation. With an increased number of available windows for rail and road, better utilisation of facilities will translate to a better cost outcome for customers. The Southern Link Logistics Park will create deep economic value for the region. The benefit of the single site investment is that it allows capital release for customers and moves their expenditure from fixed to variable cost, transferring risk and freeing up capital. Tackling city traffic congestion head-on, the Southern Link Logistics Park stands away from the bustling heart of the city, reducing over 19,000 truck movements annually from Dunedin city streets onto rail. The Southern Link Logistics Park will provide a reduction in transport carbon emissions through the establishment of a green corridor to and from Port Otago, aligning with the Dunedin City Council's commitment to a zero carbon 2030 plan for climate change. And by shifting freight transport to rail, we reduce congestion and truck movements, making our streets safer and significantly reducing road maintenance costs. Not only will this help streamline logistics and supply chain movements, increase and future-proof productivity, and maintain the cost per tonne, but it also offers customers increased capacity and the reassurance of long-term network resilience across the southern region. With New Zealand's risk of seismic events and adverse weather, the Southern Link Logistics Park reduces wharf infrastructure risk and provides supply chain resilience, notably across Canterbury South, in the event of a natural disaster affecting access to Littleton. The new site takes the pressure off Port Otago's congested container terminal, where reclaiming land for empty and full containers is no longer feasible. An inland logistics park unlocks port capacity for more warehousing and packing. This is achieved by using existing KiwiRail services to and from Port Otago. The Southern Link Logistics Park offers transformative environmental benefits by moving freight from road to rail, reducing urban transport congestion, improving road safety, curbing carbon emissions, and creating a green corridor for transport, while significantly reducing road maintenance costs. The Southern Link Logistics Park will spur substantial job growth in the construction phase and in the first decade of operation. The combined experience, investment, and the recommended greenfield location is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We seek support from the community, local government and Waka Kotahi to rezone the proposed rural site, aligning it to the zoning classification for neighbouring industrial properties. We have a rare chance to future-proof the needs of the customer at every step and produce the most agile and responsive logistics solution in the South Island with the latest equipment and state-of-the-art technology. The Southern Link Logistics Park supports a sustainable 50-year supply chain vision for Dunedin City and the southern region, with infrastructure that can create more for all.
Thank you for that. I couldn't get that to work on my computer. It wanted me to sign on with some Google login password thing that I didn't have, but so that's good to see that. And Mr. Page, I just presume that very last bit isn't that relevant. You're not seeking a zoning change here. Of course, we can't do that. You're just seeking an input to the FDS.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the video wasn't prepared for the purposes specifically of today, but we thought it was useful because there were a whole lot of questions arising from the staff recommendation about how is this thing going to work, and that was the easiest explanation that we could think of. So Pete's here to explain how it's going to work. And do you want to start with the rail loop question that was asked of Bridget about whether that still needed to be part of the process?
Yeah, I think I'd like to start a wee bit back if we can. This is just a vision, which is an idea, and it's what we call what. And together we've got to work out what the how is. Now, I'm no expert, and I left school in the fourth form. And I started sitting in the passenger seat of a truck with my dad in 1977 carting wood chip to Port Chalmers. So Port Chalmers is my second home. what I have been able to do is travel the world and looked at a lot of expert inland ports and design, and our transport company isn't really a transport company, it's a solution architect company. We've done a lot of awesome stuff for Fonterra. We've got a massive IT innovation company going on in our awesome hub in Dunedin, and this is just a vision. But the question I'd like to ask is, what if we don't do this? You know, at the point now, we've got significant freight coming on in the next decade, and if we don't do something, and I'm not saying this is the ideal, but if we don't do something, what is going to happen is we're going to get clogged up on the roads in Dunedin out to port, and it's going to be inefficient to actually make the port viable and trucking viable, therefore freight will end up going elsewhere. We've got inland import goods coming through Littleton that are going to Wanaka and Queenstown, which we can actually capture if something like this is designed, and it's actually what good looks like. That's the key thing. You know, for us is we want to make the port viable to make more money where everyone benefits, and this is just a part of this, how this can work. So, questions?
I'm sure we will have some. Andrew, start at your end of the table.
It's interesting the way you've described the business, because you're not a developer, obviously. You're a problem solver. That's what I sense. Is that a fair description?
Yep, but a quick learner.
I suppose my other query is around when you set off on this journey and where you're at this point, were you able, and just forgetting about this current process, I suppose, but up until this point, were you able to achieve the objectives you set out when, was it 4 years ago, I think it was quoted in the video, that when this, I suppose, process started for yourself and your organisation?
The idea come really when Fonterra put their site up on the market about 4 years ago, and that's when we had the vision for an inland port, because what we seen is we need rail to be more efficient, and rail isn't efficient at the moment, and it's because infrastructure is not there for it. So the key thing is to build the right infrastructure, and you need a shuttle hub for trains to go to port, and our ultimate goal is to run full trains out of Southland and South Canterbury back into a hub here or into Port Otago.
So just to be clear, that this particular site essentially ticks all the boxes from your perspective?
Yeah, this site is actually critical because you need the volume from Fonterra. They've got a small site in there now, and it's too small to turn into a shuttle. So we'd have to stump up the cost to move the containers across the road, which isn't a major, but having their volume makes a whole shuttle train from the site to Port Otago really feasible.
And I guess following on from Andrew's question is like, why this site? Why not anywhere else in Otago? Why actually here?
It's a good question. Like there's definitely other sites. There's a Kiwi Rail land between Gladstone Road and Burn Street, which is about 75,000 square metres. But I don't think the council would like us building stores and having a CT site there loading trains. And it's a little bit unsafe because it's long and narrow. And you need to be close to Fonterra because you need that freight to make it all work. What's tried hard to understand is at the port now you've got the containers that can stack up to 4 or 5 high, and when a boat comes in they might want that container too, so they've got to take the first 3 off to get to that second one, which is all cost. Where if you had something like this established somewhere, and in 4 days before the boat turns up, if you've got efficient shuttle train running, you can rail the containers in 4 days prior and have them only 2 or 3 stack, but all those containers go on the boat. So it's just been really efficient, and it's been better than Littleton. That's the whole key.
So we'll operate more as like a just-in-time system in terms of when the ship turns up. So I guess the long-term vision is there'll be very little container storage at port or any of the port sites. The long-term would be all at that freight hub, so that it could operate as just-in-time to meet the required ship.
Yeah, with the growth, like Port Otago is now suffocating. So with the growth of freight coming in and the opportunity of us trying to get freight out of South Canterbury, it'll always be a container port. It just will be an efficient container port, not a inefficient container port, because they'll have the room. So you got to, when you, no, not trying to be, but when you build a business, you've got to build a foundation before growth, and this is what we're doing.
Having listened to the response to the previous question, it raises a question for me, which might more be a Phil question than one for yourself, which is around the MPS HPL and what the legal implication would be if it's included or not included, or in the future in an RMA scenario, alternatives are asked about. So what's the difference at this stage? And so that's why I think it's a Phil question about the highly productive land MPS being dealt with now within this planning document.
Well, I think the HPL exceptions and how they work is a me question that I can come back to you on. But are you asking Pete to consider why is this site the best site, even though it's NPS HPL land?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't really looked at any other alternatives. And the main reason is because you need that freight from Fonterra. So the further you go away from that, then the further the cost that someone has to pay, and it won't be them, to get the freight to that shuttle run. Now, you need their freight to make the shuttle run feasible. So the closer to Fonterra, the better off we are.
So for me, that answer is saying logistically, it's the only location that really works. And I think, is that how I'm hearing your?
It's the most cost-effective one. Yep.
Leads me to my other questions, if I can get. Knowing that Wakatahi prefers left-on, left-off preferences for state highways and those sort of things, and various transport movements, and that there's travel through Mosgill's an issue. What are your thoughts on the location of either the bypass or the ring road, and being required to enable us to happen?
Well, at the moment, we've been carting between 20 and 25 boxes a day out of Fonterra from to Port Chalmers, and also at a Lineage cool store, which is next door. Brian Bennett's been carting around 20 plus boxes a day out of there. So if we had the shuttle train in there, then those boxes would disappear onto rail, but they would be replaced with curtain-sider trucks. Now, our obligation is, as I said, we're a solution architect. We've got a very good relationship with Kiwi Rail, but we want to promote rail better than anything else, because my job is to be better than my competition, and my job is to deliver a solution to our customers. Now, that solution to customers will be road, rail, ocean. And for 70% of the time, we want to go on rail, but for 30%, it needs to be loaded out quick on a boat. There's many reasons. So I honestly don't think there will be any increase in truck movements from down Mosgill for the first 5 years. Now, does there need to be a bypass? Absolutely. But there's a number of reasons. Heavy bypasses for heavy trucks, and Riccarton Road is a bit of a challenge for a truck driver's point of view. The ultimate bypass would be down Gladfield Road and then coming up Duke's Road, because there's only about 3 houses there. Now, the cost of that's going to be between 40 and 45 million. The bridge is 25 million. You put stoplights. This is just a point of view. And it can be achieved, but, it's not going to happen today or tomorrow. It's a 5-year plan. But together, if we collectively go as a team and push the barrier to NZTA and others, we can get there. Jingers, we pay over $10 million a year in road users. That's got some, unfortunately aren't able to spend that. We would like to, but I think together we need to go as a team and beat the doors down wherever needed to actually get this achieved and across the line.
And last question really relates to efficiencies from rail. Why isn't this in Gore or somewhere else if there's a large amount of freight coming up via State Highway 1 and then being off-roaded here onto rail?
It's all about cost effective. So when you've got a wagon on a truck which is about 20 metres long, you can fit 2 container curtain siders on. So your payload can be about 36 tonne payload. When you put it into a container, 40 foot, which that 40 foot only goes on that 20 metre wagon, you're at 28 tonne payload. So there's one reason. The second reason is we want to get best utilisation out of the port land. It's worth $1,000 a square metre. We're out at somewhere around Mosgiel, 200, whatever. But so the closer to the port you can be, but out of town, you can get so much efficiency in a shuttle train. The further you move that shuttle train, the worse it becomes on the consistency. And again, you've got the auto signalling for rail, which starts at Mosgiel and goes to port. It does not pass Mosgiel. So therefore, if a train comes through, you can't put another train on until it gets to Mosgiel. So everything gets out of kilter.
So just for clarification, you're talking about tableted system or single use running on the line until it gets to the next station, and you're talking about bogeyed and UK wagons or whatever when you're talking about?
Mr. Dine, I'll just start with the Edendale traffic, which I assume is what you're talking about for Fonterra. So does that come up non-containerised and then it goes to, they then take it to their facility in Mosgiel and that's where they containerise it, is it?
About 65% goes to Mosgiel curtain cider and then containerised to go to port. The remainder goes direct to Port Otago curtain cider and then container on site.
And I'm just interested where you got the $40 to $45 million for Gladfield Road upgrades. Okay, because the number that NZTA is quoting is more like the $200 million mark, so I'm just interested. It's quite a large gap between the two. My early question was, is this actually, as you're describing it, I think I'm getting a clearer understanding of what you might be asking for here. Is this primarily for the activities that are going on at the site at the moment, or is this planned to be a full Otago Southland regional inland port when it fully steps up?
It'll be fully Otago Southland, potentially South Canterbury.
How will the material get to the inland port from the exporters?
Very good question. There's a number of big customers that we're in discussions with down in Southland, which we would like to build a facility either at freight haulage at Clifton in Invercargill or on Kiwi Rail land site in Invercargill. And if we can achieve that, which is not that hard, then we'd like to run full trains from Invercargill straight into the inland. Now, the ultimate goal will be is to backload freight back on those trains, back into Southland. That would be the ultimate goal, but that will take time. But initially, at the moment, you've got Southport that's only got one shipping company that comes in a fortnight, and as businesses down there getting bigger, one shipping company, let alone once a fortnight, isn't enough for them. They're already sending product on truck to Port Otago now.
Sorry.
But if we can put it on rail to run more efficiently and cost effectively, and with having the payloads on trains that far superior than trucks, then it's a no-brainer to them.
Yeah, there's no doubt about the benefits an inland port can bring. So it's track warrant below Wingatui actually, as opposed to below Mosgiel, but that's all right for you guys because that's probably why it is signalled to Wingatui. Below that's track warrant, and that takes 3 freight trains a day, which is apparently, for some reason, it's 3 in each direction, so 6 movements a day. So how are you going to put the extra train on you've just mentioned in that track warrant system?
That's from Southland coming up. Yeah, so again, we've been in discussions with Kiwi Rail. We've talked to them their plans, but they, at the moment, you've got 3 out of those 3 trains. Partly of them, they run the whole thing into town, and then they unhook half of it, which then comes back out to Mosgiel. So they'd run 1 full train into town, and then they'd run 1 full train into Mosgiel. So yes, just utilising their assets.
That makes more sense. Now, I've done a little bit of walking around myself, and I was in at Main Freight not that long ago asking about their activities in Strathallan Street, because you're obviously aware we obviously already have activities in Strathallan Street, which is effectively for import and distribution in the city. And their feedback was that for them, this activity does need to be in the metropolitan area of sorts. Now, Mosgiel would fit that as well, because they are then distributing it back through mostly the Dunedin metropolitan area. Are you anticipating that you would pick up some of the activity that's at Strathallan Street now and that would move out there?
Yeah, like our logistics park will be, anyone's will be allowed to build their own store on the site and run it themselves, and then we just run the container. So it's for freight that doesn't have to stop in the city. That's what we'd be capturing. If it can come through the city on rail and to somewhere like Mosgiel and then back on rail to port, that's the ultimate goal. And we're taking trucks off road.
Yep. But if it's taking imported goods that are then distributed through to the city, then those are coming off rail and onto trucks. So getting back to, would you be able to make sure that they wouldn't go over 3 Mile Hill if they were delivering to the back of the hill city suburbs if they were coming out of Mosgiel?
I think with regards to freight, sorry, John, well, what I've been talking about is bulk, like milk powder, timber, etc., etc. For freight like that, especially with main freight, you've got Port Otago that's got a container depot right next door to them. They would look at moving. I think that that's owned by rail. They've got a year to go, and they're not renewing that lease because Kiwi Rail want it. Because I think main freight want that. For general freight packages, you would not take to Mosgiel, especially at main freight there, because they'll be able to drop the train off there. It'll be more efficient to take the container off and devan it there. You've got Bassocks just around the corner, and you've got Mainstream and PBT all there as well. So you would not take it to Mosgiel. You'd drop it in town at Strathallan Street. That's just for your package.
No, okay, that's clarified that well. You mentioned a log capacity at your inland port, but it didn't look particularly large. And I was wondering, the cost per tonne for second handling usually makes a certain kilometre distance out from port before you expect that a log truck is going to be willing to bother to stop. So do you anticipate that you'll actually be able to capture much log traffic based on where it is relative to where the forests are and the journey to port?
Not for the first 10 years. I think what you look at in the last 5 years has been 30,000 hectares planted in Targo, top of the south line. Sorry. So I think in 10 years' time, the traffic in Dunedin will get to a point where it's not viable to run a truck through, and land will get expensive. And so then it will be viable to go to that site or a similar site, and then you rail the logs into town. But at the moment, it's too expensive, especially for Waneta and City Forest, when you've got Targa Coast and Berwick. Time you load there and then get into Melbourne, for instance, or even into Mosgiel, you're halfway, 3/4 of the way to there. So, and the cost of unloading and reloading and stacking is, $5 or $6 a tonne.
Yep. got that number. So when you're doing this partnership with Port Otago, at the moment they don't have, in your submission you said you'd need like 3 rail lines beside each ship in order to stage the ship properly by rail. They don't have that out there at the moment. There's no capacity for any passing loops between Sawyers Bay and the town to be built anymore after the cycleway got built. So that then really pushes it out onto the port in terms of having to deal with the trains. What's their strategic position on making themselves ready for these trains?
They've been actually talking about this for a couple of years. And so they've got the money there ready to go, and it's all in their plans. They're just kind of, if this doesn't happen, then they're gonna go another way, which I'm not too sure what that is. You have to ask them. But if we can do a 3-line shuttle run at Mosgiel, they'll do the same there. And it's all there ready to go. The plans are all done. I think they're just waiting on some engineering to come back.
And so does that mean that they are, because this is all related because of logs and containers are relevant to the traffic flow in the city, have they abandoned their concept then of a log port in the inner harbour? Or are they planning to, or are we still getting logs going in there by truck?
I don't think that's a question I can answer. But,
yeah, Mr. Dines, you're not required to answer questions that are best asked of Port Otago. You're not representing them here today.
Yeah.
I completely agree, Mr. Chair, but if Port Otago isn't changing its capacity, then that's not actually an activity that they're planning on doing. So I guess we probably need clarity from Port Otago on that and their position going forward. And you did mention it in the end, Melbourne, as has come up, and it's sitting on the regional transport plan at the moment. It's not a practical inland port for imports to be distributed back to Dunedin, but what about the concept of logs that are coming from the south, or even when Fonterra maybe has to upgrade its cold storage, it's bringing the trains right past it. Is that something even Dines would be considered to be associated with in the future?
No, I think it's too far away. Like, there's a number of things with Melbourne. One is the gradient's too steep to pull out of there with a loaded train. The second thing, there's 3 roads on the main trunk line where you can't stop a train to go off into a siding. And again, the logs just from logs from south of Berwick and Otago Coast potentially could be a possibility, but definitely not for Otago Coast or Berwick, because at the time you get to Melbourne, we're over halfway to port. The cost is just too much. And the freight's just not there. And again, you've got to remember, you've got 36-tonne payload on a wagon. You want to get as far as you possibly can to the end of the destination, which is Mosgiel, to then put into a store, to put into a container, which has got 28 tonne to go into a shuttle train. The further you go back, for instance, like Melbourne, especially without the auto signalling, you won't be able to run efficient rail line, and if we don't meet deadlines to customers to meet boats, you'll end up trucking it, and that's the last thing we want.
Oh yeah, I mean, contingent to Melbourne ever getting off the ground was that signalling would have to go down to Milton. That's clear. Okay, that's me for now. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dines. It's a very good video. I had several questions, and one is you've mentioned both Port Otago and Kiwi Rail, and I think somewhere in the submission document there was mention of that. Just wondering, what is the relationship with them? They're supportive, but they're not part of you, or just to clarify how that works.
So with Kiwi Rail, we've been working with them for many years, got great relationships there. They're a reasonably big government department, we'll leave it at that, and so we're doing all the hard stuff, and then when it looks good, they'll come on board. And kind of, you could say they're a little bit with Port Otago as well, but again, we've had a great relationship with Port Otago, and they're just taking a bit slow to get up there, but they'll get there.
I totally respect that the video talked about industrial zoning, and I don't want to go there today, but and I know other sites have developed. I think there's one that's been developed somewhere around Ashburton, or maybe north of Ashburton recently, by a private company similar to yours. Which company was that? Oh, yep, that's right. So they presented it. I happen to be on the South Island Regional Land Transport Committee, and they presented to us there. Can I just understand what happens around that area with pressures or reverse sensitivity for other industrial development to occur there? Because if you do a hub here, I'm just interested in understanding the balance with other industrial land and what it might push.
Yeah, sorry, can you explain that again?
Has there been a drive at that other site for more industrial land to be developed as part of it for other associated businesses? I mean, often, even where you are existing now in Kaikoura Valley, other businesses have developed around you. And so just understanding how you may draw other activity to that point.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know if I can answer it, but if you look at history on other inland ports, other businesses have grown around them. Like, for instance, from a business point of view, weekly do I get customers coming to talk to us about how they can't get land in Dunedin, and if they can, it's $600 a square metre, and then they have to pull the building down. It's just all too expensive. And if we would like to move our trucks and that all as they would be diminishing if we get this rail thing going properly, we'd move our logistics park out there, over our whole transport out of Kaikoura Valley over to Mosgiel in time, and then they would free up land at Kaikoura to go industrial. But you're right, we've got the tyre company, the mechanic, transport repairs, they'd all move as well. So you're actually putting the right businesses in the right areas, not clogging up the city.
But it may require further industrial land nearby, potentially.
No, it's softly. History would tell you that. If you look at what's happened in the past with industrial parks, that's what's happened. So yes.
Well, considering the land, and I think we need to have our eyes really aware that this may be much bigger than the 40 hectares you're suggesting. Sorry, and confirming, I think I read it somewhere, your site in Kaikoura Valley is 20 hectares at current, and that would become available for industrial in time. Thank you. Thank you.
So Mr. Dines, just one question from me. From my understanding of your evidence, that stage one, as you propose it, is, and these are my words, not yours, essentially heavy vehicle neutral in terms of Gordon Road, more or less. Can you just walk us through that very simply, why that's the case?
Okay, so at the moment, this doesn't happen all year round. This happens for about 3 or 4 months of the year, which is predominantly November, December, not so much in January, but February, March, a little bit in April. But so what happens is export, that's when the export market's hot. So at the moment, we're carting between 20 and 25 boxes a day out of Fonterra to Port Otago, because they can't put another rail shunt on because they're not guaranteed the boxes, because Fonterra pay a take or pay for the train. So the Fonterra got to pay for the whole train. So that some days it's 25 boxes, other days it's 10, some days it's 30. So that happens for about 4 months, depending on the season, depending on the market. And again, Lineage Cool Store next door, which does Silver Fern Farm, it's very similar numbers. It's at the peak of the season, it's around 2025. So if we were able to, for there to be a logistics part put anywhere, and you have the 3 rail lines, all those boxes would go on the shuttle, because they would go straight for storage, as we've explained, and then 4 or 5 days out before the boat got here, they'd go straight to Port Otago. So you're taking predominantly 30 to 40 trucks off the road at peak. We technically would replace them with curtain size. Now, I actually don't think we would replace them all with curtain size, to be honest. But some of them would be replaced by curtain size, but I've got to cover myself. So that's why I say it's neutral.
And does that then, from what you've said, is that predominantly based on the Fonterra trade?
No, it's the timber trade, we'd be bringing timber in from Pampac, which is predominantly 8 to 10 loads a day. We'd be bringing in maybe Dunedin out of Clydevale, even though they've got a store at Sawyers Bay that Portaga own. But if you want to be smart in your business, we'd potentially put them out at Mosgiel because it makes sense, and then free that store up in Sawyers Bay for South Canterbury volume.
All right, and Mr. Page or Mr. Kyle, I'd appreciate it if you could work with Mr. Dines to put that down on paper so that his simple explanation from his business perspective is understandable to us as a panel that doesn't deal in those matters. So I appreciate your verbal response, but if we could have that in writing, and if you could take the care with the help from council and your planner to put that in language that we'd understand, I'd appreciate that. And if that's possibly done by midday tomorrow, that'd be wonderful.
All good.
Mr. Page, 2 questions for you arising out of the discussion. If we were to accept the submission that's before us, and if we were to take the approach that I discussed with you regarding the same approach that's been taken in the draft FDS on figure 29 of the document, if we were to do that, and you can either answer this straight away or come back in writing, will that trigger clause 3.5, bracket 7, bracket B, bracket 1 of the MPS HPL? So it's on page 10 of the MPS HPL.
Yes, I haven't brought a hard copy of the NPS HPL with me. Just a moment, we'll find it. Case Mike.
3.57.
3.5, bracket 7, bracket B, bracket Romans 1. If we took the same approach as shown on figure 29 of the draft FPS.
Well, the difficulty with saying that it would trigger 7b Romans 1 is the words "at the commencement date" in the final line of clause 357. So, of course, the FDS did not apply at the commencement date of the NPS HPL, so no, that exception wouldn't be met.
That's not the answer I was expecting. So, Mr. Garrett, when you do your end of hearing report, if you could answer that same question for us, that would be great. Thank you. And second question, if we were to include the freight hub along the lines, similar lines to what's in figure 29 of the draft FBS at the moment, am I correct in assuming that the only challenge to that is by way of judicial review through the High Court, if some party wished to challenge that?
I'm sorry, I wasn't paying sufficient attention. Could you ask that again?
If we were to agree with the submission that's currently before us, and if we were to indicate a location for an inland freight hub, as has been sought by you, taking the same approach or a similar approach that's in figure 29 of the draft PS, if some party wanted to challenge that, is the avenue for challenge a judicial review through the High Court?
Yeah, that's the only way.
Yeah.
But that is only if there was an error of law committed along the way. The merits of your decision isn't challengeable in any court.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's we've got one more person as part of your team that we yet to hear from.
Thank you, John. Could you introduce yourself and?
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the panel. I'm John Kyle. I'm a resource management consultant based here in Dunedin. You'll see from my evidence, though, that I don't spend too much time here in Dunedin, and I think this is probably my first appearance in a hearing in Dunedin for about 5 years. What I do is get involved in large-scale infrastructure projects and large-scale plan change projects around the country, and you would have noted from my evidence that I say to you there that whilst you may have this natural want to resolve all of the constraints before you put a pin on the map with respect to an inland logistics hub, you don't need to worry too much about that, because the process to come is, well, it'll make this one look quite small in comparison, and I don't like to say that in earshot of Mr. Dines too much, but in order to give life to a project of this nature, a number of the constraints that will, that have been already identified with respect to the site and the project itself will need to be resolved, and that will take considerable work to address. And the issues that have been raised around this table today around, well, what if, the answers to those will necessarily be required to be resolved. So things like the roading and transportation issues, would an ITA be required? Of course it would, yes. Service infrastructure, that would need to be squarely addressed and resolved. Issues around flood management and flood hazard, a high level of collaboration with the regional council and the city would be necessary to work through those issues, and of course good engineering as a prerequisite to any plan change. Something you may not appreciate with respect to the plan change process: would it be necessary for the proponent of a facility like this have to demonstrate need? Yes. That is one of the considerations that would need to be brought to bear within a plan change process. And there were questions earlier around alternative sites. Would they need to be addressed in a plan change process? And the answer to that, again, is yes. So whilst putting a pin in the map with respect to this process is helpful for many reasons, and many of those have been outlined already, there's a heck of a lot of discipline to go through and a lot of work to do in order to sort of prove the case from a consenting or a plan change point of view. And getting back to, I think it was Councillor Noon's question earlier about the council getting out of the way, I personally don't see it that way myself. The work we do in the plan change space, there's a heck of a lot that goes on up front in assessing issues and the effects of any given plan change, and the collaborative effort required with councils, other agencies, stakeholders is enormous. So I don't see this so much as a process of asking the council to get out of the way. It's actually to maybe get in line and help out, because the effort ahead of Mr. Dines and his commercial team is a significant one in order to give life to this particular project, from whether it's a plan change, resource consent, or any other type of consenting environment that he ultimately ends up in. So all of those things necessarily involve a high level of working together, as I see it. The other question that I'd quite like to address relates to one I can't recall, I think it may have come from over here, around designation. And the answer that Mr. Page gave was exactly right. Mr. Dines is not a requiring authority, but he could become one. Or the port could become one, but that at the moment probably isn't viable, because the RMA reform was pulled, as you know. That part of that reform did include ports being able to become requiring authorities for projects. In the life of this particular project, there will be some changes made to the RMA, we know that, and it could be to broaden out the ability of other entities to become requiring authorities, like port authorities, for example. So designation is a potential pathway forward. Is it a necessary one? We don't know. We haven't done any scoping in that space yet, but it's very early days in terms of formulating a consenting or a plan change strategy. Mr. Chair, I wasn't going to take you too much through my evidence. I know you've read it, and I know the panel would have read that and my rebuttal statement, and I thank you for doing that. And I'm just happy to answer any questions because we're a minute over time now.
Thank you, Mr. Kyle. Appreciate that. Andrew, any questions from Mr. Kyle? No, Jerry?
Just to clarify, as you say about being a pin on a map, so by the FDS including the freight hub, that's really a nice to have.
I think it's more than a nice to have. If you look at the scheme of where these FDS documents fit in now, in the light of the National Policy Statement UD, I think their function is actually quite important, because what it does is it foreshadows an expectation. And because of that expectation, then I would like to think that will assist, will lubricate the discussions that necessarily have to be had with roading authorities, council as service provider, that kind of thing. So if you have that pin in the map, then you're in a better position to say, well, look, we're all focused here. How do we make this work? And the example I gave in my evidence of the, and I hate to use a Canterbury example as some kind of way forward for Otago, that really grates me, but that was an early attempt at what is effectively an FDS for Canterbury in the light of the earthquakes. And that has really focused all of the agencies, focused their attention on how do we enable those things to work. And in some cases, the future development areas that I've referred to there, they haven't been able to work because there are other constraints that were insurmountable. But land has been better able to be unlocked for the purpose assigned because of its inclusion in Map A of the regional policy statement there right from the get-go. It helped everybody focus on where to drive toward those infrastructure responses, how to resolve transportation issues, all of those things.
Thank you. So it's more enabling. Thank you.
Or just enabling towards causative, though? I mean, that's the issue. I mean, how deal with their district plans when it came to that FDS in the emergency of the earthquake?
They're still going through that process, and WIMAC's in the same boat. They've still had to go through. If we take the future development areas, all of those areas have still had to go through the zoning process, or the rezoning process. And it's interesting watching the developers. They think inclusion as an FDA is a big tick you're in. What they've learned, I guess, the hard way, some of them, is that actually there's a whole lot of work to be done to show why those areas should be within an urban zone, whether it's residential or business. So those processes are still working their way through. Selwyn is quite a way through their plan review. We're dealing with appeals now. WIMAC is just in the midst of its hearings on the proposed plan. Christchurch City, its plan was done for it by another agency, and that was quite a rapid process.
And then I think it's getting clearer in my head, and I think it's interesting to see some of the people who have submitted saying words like surety and signalling, when what you're saying is really it's an ability to focus for plan decisions that will come later once you've said this focus area exists.
Exactly.
Having heard Mr. Dines talk about there will be a draw for more industrial land around a hub or a transport facility as described, I'm nervous not to acknowledge that in an FDS. Or do you think there's enough other industrial land nearby that wouldn't be a concern? Should we add this in?
I think your own reports tell you already that there's a critical shortage of industrial land in Dunedin City, short term and for the longer haul. Mr. Dine's point whereby his own operation may vacate what is quite nice industrial land on Kaikorai Valley Road, that could free up some of that land closer to the city. But I would have thought one of your, and I haven't got all the answers for you on this one because it's not really my role, but I would have thought that one of the big things you need to think about in formulating this FDS in its final form is how on earth you're going to deal with this industrial shortfall in the city and provide sufficient land of sufficient scale. I don't think your officers have kind of invited you to say, well, hang on, you need to put servicing and all those other things first. Those issues do need to be resolved, but should that stop you from identifying future industrial land? I don't think it should, because without it, the city is in dire trouble from an economic point of view.
I could go down a rabbit hole there, and I'm not sure I need to today.
I'd agree with that.
Thank you.
All right, well, Mr. Kyle, no further questions from me. Thank you for your evidence. It was very clearly put, so I appreciate that. And Mr. Page, just been thinking about your answer. I do see the importance of those words at commencement, so I understand exactly what you're saying there. So, Mr. Garrett, I don't need you to address that in reply now. It's crystal clear. So what that means, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that any of the NPS HPL issues that have to be worked through at a subsequent plan change or consenting phase?
Yes. So what we had envisaged is that specific identification of the site in the FDS would help us with a clause 3.6 argument under the NPS HPL, not 3.57. Having said that, Mr. Garbutt and I are both expecting to receive some direction from the Environment Court relatively soon on how clause 3.57 works, but that's in relation to some leftover 2GP appeals that he and I are both working on.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think that's the end of our questions for you. Is there anything that you'd like to say by way of conclusion at this stage?
No, I think you've more than got the gist of it. I'm just checking our to-do list of things that you would like from us. You would like some supplementary evidence from Pete to explain why in stage 1 it's going to be heavy vehicle neutral.
Yep, and those are my words, not his. So
Yeah. There is a very brief explanation at paragraph 16 of his rebuttal statement, but you'd like us to tease that out.
Yeah, I read that, but that's why I asked the question. I thought, well, I just want a little bit more understanding of what's sitting in behind that.
Yeah, so we can do that by lunchtime tomorrow. I think I'm coming back to see you at some stage tomorrow anyway. And Bridget's going to give you a track chain version of the provisions. Those are the two things that you'd like from us.
Yep, that's correct. Or just any panel members, anything further that you'd like from this submittal? No, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for your...
Well, no, for coming in and presenting your material. It's obviously a very important issue that we'll need to turn our minds to, and I can assure you we will be doing that. Yep. So we're just running a little bit over time. Next submitter is Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins, thanks for your patience. Does any panel member need a short break, or are we good to go? Good to go? All right.
Is that when I want to talk? Yep.
Right, good afternoon and welcome. We've received and read the original submission that you put in, so you don't need to reread that to us, but you're very welcome to speak to that and highlight key points for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm Calvin Collins, but I've only got the 2 points. But before I begin, as a disclosure, I'm the landowner of 4A and 10 Brayside Road, which is subject to an appeal to the 2GP. But I also believe my thoughts are logical and represent the market. So, firstly, I obviously support the strong growth criteria, and I think this is conservative, depending on your vision for the township. You know, the things have changed since COVID, and the workforce throughout New Zealand has now reassessed the necessity to be located in metropolitan areas, and Dunedin offers a lifestyle that few places have, and is a good position to attract entrepreneurs and business people for employment opportunities. There's potential for the city to grow faster than in the past, and faster than other cities in the country, and create a thriving environment. And I think if you look at Hamilton, just came out with a 5% growth. Well, I'd rather live in Dunedin than Hamilton. Secondly, I think the future development strategy states that it should provide for well-functioning environments, that there's a variety of homes to meet Dunedin current and foreseeable needs. And one of the pillars is obviously that Dunedin has a range of quality housing choices to provide a home for everyone. The current document focuses on intensification to supply housing growth. I think the housing capacity study that was done, that's in your October 23 report, states that 30% of the population want to live in an apartment terrace house. Your future development study draft paper states that that's more like 50%, and there's a recent move towards attached houses. But I think this should be taken with an open mind, as I believe that there's a shortage of desirable sections for standalone houses, and many of the consented townhouse and apartment consents have also not been acted upon. And that's mainly due to limited purchaser demand. So, you know, why would you buy an apartment for $700K when you can buy a house in Dunedin for the same price? So, although in theory it sounds good to intensify, but practically it may not be successful. Your recent central government change to allow planning criteria to allow intensification was because major cities need to intensify due to the lack of growth, lack of land for growth, and the better affordability apartments. And I don't see that as being an issue for Dunedin. Dunedin is surrounded by non-productive land. It also has some of the cheapest housing in the country. The medium sale price here is $575,000 compared to a national average of $760,000. And the only cities that are lower than Dunedin are Invercargill, West Coast and Palmerston North. So you actually have an affordable city as it is. Places like Auckland, Queenstown, etc. have to go the apartment line to get affordability. I go back to your strategic direction, which states Dunedin has a range of quality housing choices that provide a home for everyone. Intensification is good in some areas, but it needs to be balanced. Dunedin doesn't have, in my mind, an affordability issue, it has a quality issue. Many of your older double brick and timber villas struggle to meet the healthy home standards and are poorly designed for sun, poorly insulated, plus require high maintenance. If you look at a housing preference survey in 2023, 25% of families and 18% of the overall population would like to live in a standalone house on a 2,000 square metre section. I don't believe, I might have missed it, but your FDS is not catering for those 25% of families who want to live in a large section and allow the kids in the backyard to play cricket. It's estimated that there's 1,600 more homes needed in the next 3 years by 2027. If you use 18% or 25% of families or 18% of the total population here, you need a further 300 large lot residential sites to cater for that. And your FDS is not providing for large lot residential. I go back to your NPS on urban development. Dunedin has a range of quality housing, which is one of your criteria, and I don't believe that your FDS is actually providing for a range of quality housing. The outcome proposed, land should be identified in the FDS as suitable for large lot residential housing. More particularly, the properties of 4A and 10 Brayside Road be identified as suitable for either residential or large lot residential housing. The land is not productive, it's bounded by residential on two sides. The properties already have water and wastewater services available, as identified in an AR Associates report in 2019 commissioned by DCC. So the land is suitable for development in the short term. In closing, Dunedin has an opportunity of being a great lifestyle city, but needs a range of quality housing to provide for that. I've almost caught up on time.
Thank you. I'll see if we have questions. Kate, we'll start at your end of the table.
United have a couple, and I'm making some assumptions when you're talking large lot residential, you're talking about low density housing. And then the follow on from that was with regard to the existing Three Waters infrastructure, and just whether you've had any discussion with council around capacity to enable that land use change from rural to low density housing.
It's a product that's not common in the city. My apologies. It's a product that's not common in the city, but there is demand for it for 2,000 square metre sections. People don't necessarily want 5 acres. They just want privacy and a bit of grass for their kids to run around on. And a well-designed development of 2,000 to 3,000 square metre sections can cater for most of your lifestyle developments. Sorry, the second point, and services. Yeah, the services have been identified in AR and Associates report, which is commissioned by DCC, and there's water available to that site and there's sewage available to the site. Stormwater is obviously an issue that has to be addressed with ORC.
Just coming back to your preference or a percentage of housing stock or sites available on larger sites. So that concept. What's your comment around, as we've got an ageing population, and as that ageing population move from the larger sites, the family home, into something a little bit more compact, a little bit more easy to look after, in other words, a small amenity space, etc. Do you not think that there would be a degree of those larger sites becoming available for that market that you've been talking about? Would you think is that a fair assumption, or am I off the mark?
So my apology. If we have a situation that 18% of the Dunedin population, as per your housing survey, want to live on a larger site, that's 300 house sites now. You don't have that. And where you have in the past rezoned large lot residential, you put it in gullies, as you put it in areas that aren't really suitable for residential development. So it's in areas that aren't really desirable. So you're cutting up some big blocks of land, 5 acre blocks and that sort of stuff. You'd be better off putting them into rural residential or lifestyle large lot residential type sites. The demand, there's a lot of people, and I use planning, if you look at Highgate, top of the hill, they have nowhere to go. They go to Wanaka because there's nothing around here for them to move out. They need to move out of those houses so that people from schools, you need to get rid of the empty nesters so that the kids, families with kids that need to go to school are living in those areas, but they don't have anywhere to go. So I think our feedback has been there's strong demand from families that don't have kids, professional families, etc., who want to live in a different environment, and there's also families that from empty nesters who want to go to a different environment than what they've got now. So you're not allowing the opportunity of the person from South Dunedin to move to Mornington, to move to Highgate, to move to somewhere else. That once you get a house here, you end up living in a house, and that's because I think there's been a lack of product for those people to move on to. Now, some might go into apartments, but they're probably more likely to go to retirement village.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. No further questions from me. I think you'd see that not many of us had questions for you. All that means is that we've clearly understood your submission and your verbal presentation today, so there's nothing we needed to clarify with you, but don't take that as a lack of interest. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And our next submitter is John Stewart. All right. So, Mr Chair, good afternoon and welcome. We've read the original submission that you lodged. You don't need to read that out to us, but you're very welcome to speak to that and highlight key points. And I see you have a handout for us. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's just the basic first letter that I wrote.
Yep.
Okay.
I've got another handout that I'll show that later. Okay.
Just need to push the red button on one of those mics, or the button at the base of one of those mics, just down the bottom. So when your red light's on, then we can hear you.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. I'm here just as a private citizen. I'm mainly talking about Area 7, densification of Area 7, which is Kaikorai. So there's the map. Firstly, I read thoroughly the submission that you did, the FDS report. Just from my point of view, I can't see the population growth that justifies further densification of certain areas. That's going back, what, to 1999, and it would seem pretty static to me. The area that Area 7 is already quite densely populated. In addition, at the top of the hill of what is mainly valley, steep valley, on top of the hill there's a sewage line that hasn't been worked on for a very long time, and my neighbours and I suspect is leaking, which could affect the stability of the land underneath. Some work has been attempted by the Dunedin City Council very, very pleasantly, thank you very much. But we still have doubts because of the amount of standing water, springs at the top of the valley, that whether further work needs to be done. It's a very, very deep sewage line, and it's right at the top of that valley above Area 7. It could therefore be questioned whether the land will be stable for further development going forward. Here's a picture of the area concerned. I can't personally see many opportunities to further densify the area. In particular, at the top of the area, Tyne Street, there's three, in the area there are 3 very large residential homes, 2 large schools, marae, and the parking there is often full up, which can be a problem with the large number of children dropped off the school and the amount of traffic going through, which would only get worse. Again, this is a picture from my house, the roof, that's the roof of the house below me. That's an indication of how steep the slope is. Again, we got about 6 layers of houses going down there before you get to the bottom of the valley. It's very steep indeed, and it's very intensively built on already. There are a large number of retaining walls. This one is a good wall. It's unaffected, but I have neighbours that have got cracks in the wall, as mentioned in the email that a neighbour received that I showed earlier. Again, that is the roof of the house, so there's a 6-foot retaining wall there. Now, in terms of, on the submission it says where else can you build? Well, about a year and a half ago, Top 10 Holiday Park was bought specifically for housing, and nothing's been done about it. So my submission is that you're going to intensify building on a steep slope with lots of retaining walls with a sewer at the top of the valley that is at best suspect, when you have plenty of alternatives to build and densify. and you haven't, and no one has touched that site yet, and no one's even staying in the flats that are on site. There you go. I think I've said enough.
All right, thank you. I'll see if we have questions for you. Kate, any questions?
Thank you. Just for clarity, for the areas that you're concerned with or that have been mapped, are they as equally developed as the sites that you've shown us?
I was only talking about...
Sorry, Mr. Collins, you just need to push that button every time because someone else pushes their button, it cuts you off.
Sorry about that. For clarity, I have 10 minutes, so I was just talking about Site 7. As a child engineer, I can't help noticing that South Dunedin had a big red sticker on it about 5 years ago, and now miraculously it seems to be okay to build on. But for the sake of 10 minutes, I would say that the Kaikorai is superbly unsuitable for further development because of the steep hill, the number of retaining walls, and a suspect sewer at the top of it. And there are many, many more appropriate areas in the Dunedin region for development.
Well, it appears we have no questions or clarification for you, Mr. Stewart, and that just means we've understood your submission to us. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much.
Now, our next submitter is name withheld. But we don't have anyone here. So what we'll do is we'll adjourn for a little break now and we'll reconvene either when name withheld turns up or at 3:30. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We'll resume the hearing. It's a little bit early, but I think we're ready to go. So, Ms. Peters, if you're happy to come on up, your same seat you had last week. All right, you all sorted?
Thank you.
All right, so good afternoon and welcome. Just confirming, so today you're presenting on behalf of 4 submitters, the Holly Trust, Wendy Campbell, Ross McCleary, and now DDS Properties 2008 Limited.
Yes, that's correct.
Yep. And each of those submitters is seeking additional greenfield residential areas within the FDS, and all of those 4 submitters are subject to 2 GP appeals to a greater or lesser extent.
Correct.
Great. All right then. Well, we've read the original submissions. We've read the evidence that you've provided in support of some of those submitters, and so you don't need to read that out to us, but you're very welcome to speak either individually, speak to those submissions either on an individual basis or a collective basis, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to speak to each individually. I think that would make the most sense going through. But the first thing that I'd like to say is that I'm actually quite excited about presenting to you all today on today and tomorrow actually on these various submission sites that provide some broad locations in which future housing capacity and development can be provided. So the first of these obviously is the Holly Trust site, and the location of the land that's sort of proposed for that is included in Appendix 1 of the evidence and Figure 1 of the submission. So it involves 9 properties, and there's approximately 16.6 hectares in the submission site. So at a density of general residential 1, that would provide for somewhere in the vicinity of 250 to 290 houses. If you leave sort of 30-40% of the land for roading and excess stormwater infrastructure, reserves, that kind of thing. So there's a couple of things to note about the site, and there's most of the properties in it are relatively small, less than or around that hectare sort of size. The area that has the red hatching within Appendix 1 is obviously the Variation 2 site, which is a larger site. And the other thing that is interesting is that there are various service connections to these properties currently. So paragraph 33 of my evidence shows that there are a number of different properties that are included within the water zone boundary, with including the larger site that's the subject of a Variation 2 appeal. That also, all those properties have water connections. And several of them have private connections through to DCC, Three Waters, particularly the wastewater network. I think kind of where I'd like to start, and it's this part probably applies to all of these submission sites that are wanting to be included in the FDS for future residential greenfield zoning. There's a couple of tests laid out in the MPSUD, and the first is that council must provide at least sufficient development capacity in existing and new urban areas. So there's a couple of things about that. First is that the at least sufficient can't act as a cap on development. So it wouldn't be correct for council to only apply just sufficient for it. It needs to be at least as a minimum, so something more than that. And secondly, that test is included in both in terms of the MPSUD requirements, but also in the requirements for a future development strategy. So, in my mind at least, that test means that the bulk of housing capacity must be within a district plan, and but then the majority of the long-term kind of provisions are going to be within a future development strategy. The future development strategy can also needs to set out the infrastructure that's required for any future areas of urban growth, and also any constraints on development. And the majority of the constraints on development are going to be site-specific, to do with the land and its any particular issues that has going on. The other test that I think is really important, particularly in the context of the Dunedin Future Development Strategy, is the requirement to provide a variety of housing capacity, to provide choice for different household types in terms of type of housing, price and location. This test is really important because I don't think that Dunedin's reliance within its housing capacity assessment on intensification fully meets this test. So there's a couple of issues with the housing capacity assessment relying heavily on intensification, both within Dunedin urban environment and Mosgiel. And one of those is that the one of them is that the requirement for intensification really relies on developers, in quotation marks, because they can obviously be Joe Bloggs around Dunedin that do this kind of thing, assuming the risk of intensification. So by that I mean that, and it's noted in the housing capacity assessment, that for most of Dunedin areas that are going to be intensified, you require a high yield to cover the higher costs of development. And that's particularly difficult, I think, particularly in the current environment, which with the bank lending and interest rates, and also the gap between houses consented versus construction. The housing capacity assessment notes that. And I think it's also going to become increasingly difficult in terms of insurance. So I know recently there was an ODT article stating that one of the intensification developers in South Dunedin was looking at pulling out intensification developments there because of the lack of ability to get insurance in Dunedin, South Dunedin. In any event, intensification kind of falls into the realm of something that council can't control. It becomes a developer or a property owner decision whether or not they want to intensify. And lastly, with the HCA, I think there's difficulties with the growth projections data that it relies on, in terms of, we haven't yet had the census data, and also just that we have experienced a high period of growth that looks like it's going to continue for some time, even though it's tapering off. I note that there's various things that have been referenced in the evidence that shows that it's not yet back at 2019 levels, which we all thought were stupendous rates of migration in 2019. The FDS for Dunedin should be an ambitious document. It should be something that shows where long term, so in the next 30 years, where the city's going to grow to, and I don't think it achieves that. So in relation to this emissions site that adjoins the Mosgiel Edge, the recommending report raises several reasons for not including it in the FDS, and those boil down to infrastructure issues, the NPS HPL and hazards. If I deal with the NPS HPL first, all of the land around Mosgiel is, in the flat land, is LUC 1, 2 or 3. And just to give it some context, I actually looked up, sorry, it might be in one of my other ones, just bear with me. I'm pretty sure, sorry, off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure there was 3,000 hectares of, yes, here it goes, 3,000 hectares of LUC1 soils on the Tairi Plain. So this particular site, if I've done my maths right, represents 0.0055% of the LUC1, so that's not 2 or 3, but LUC1 soils on the Tairi Plain. I think I said last week in relation to the business land that the NPS HPL is definitely a good policy to have, but in terms of Dunedin is very restrictive because we haven't reached that cumulative tipping point that places like Pukekohe and other areas have. And the majority of our land around our urban edges is LUC 1, 2 or 3, which leaves Dunedin with very little places to grow unless land's included in an FDS and then manages to make it through to a future district plan change. I also note that there's a need for flat land for both, I suppose what you'd call retirement living, villages and care homes. I think you had a submitter last week that was saying from Somerset that their calculations are that Dunedin's going to need approximately 240, I think it was, hectares of land just for that need alone, and that's obviously land that is not available to the general public. So in order to be able to go into a rest home or retirement village, you need to meet the criteria of that, which usually involves certain levels of care or over a certain age, or both. And obviously the flat land has less of a cost in terms of development. Another reason that was raised was efficiency. This site is adjacent to, immediately adjacent to the existing urban environment. It's in close proximity to the Carlisle Street Three Waters infrastructure. As described before, there's part of the site is within the water zone boundary, and there's obviously major infrastructure within Bush Road, which had Three Waters infrastructure within that. The flooding and liquefaction hazards risks was another thing that was raised, and those are the same or similar as the existing urban environment of Mosgiel. And the evidence at paragraph 27 goes through the GDHD report, which shows that it's very little of the site has a risk in terms of flooding. Obviously the GHD report is a synthetic flood level, so it takes into account the a couple of previous historic flooding events, and then adds on the climate change kind of allowance, I suppose, and then it provides the diagrams. I think are the best way of showing how that looks. So there obviously are some lower depression sites within the submission site, but a future plan change or structure plan that would be used for stormwater management. And then with respect to infrastructure, it seems to be around three waters. I note that Table 10 of the Future Development Strategy sets out the various infrastructure upgrades that are scheduled in the short to medium term, or they're expecting to be undertaken, I should say. And the FDS really must ensure that future upgrades are strategically utilised to provide maximum development potential. And as I said before, if the uptake of intensification isn't as high as what's council's anticipating, then we're needing probably in the longer term a bit more greenfield development, or actually a lot more greenfield development around Mosgiel. Infrastructure constraints are neither a barrier to inclusion within the FDS, and they're also they don't commit council to any particular infrastructure upgrades either. Yes, I think that's about all I want to say at the moment on that one. Thank you.
All right, I'll see if we have any questions for you regarding the Holly Trust submission. Andrew? No? Sherry?
Emma, I was intrigued at your comment when you said that on this site there's some private connections to wastewater. So I'm just trying to get my head around that. So maybe.
Yes, so there's a figure that I've included in my evidence, and it's from Council's wastewater services map, and that was at paragraph 33. And in that, although it's a little bit small, there's a couple of orange lines within the site here. Those are the private connections to the wastewater network in Bush Road. My understanding is they've been there for quite some time. I don't know the genesis of those connections.
I'm imagining they must be quite historic, I'm guessing. I'm looking across at my colleague and he's smiling. I was intrigued about your comment that you say that the FDS should be an ambitious document, and I guess my question to you is, well, where do you think the growth should be? That you obviously believe there should be more identified in here.
Yes, that's correct. So I think the FDS should really clearly set out where Dunedin's going to grow into, regardless of whether there's the current capacity. And the FDS is really, the reason that it was included in the NPSUD from my understanding of it is that we've got district plans that obviously manage kind of the 10-year sort of cycle, and then we were needing longer than that in terms of where cities are going to grow, and particularly if you're going out towards 30 years, and that 20 to 30 years, that's really the provenance of the FDS. Dunedin's always lacked real vision in any of its documents in terms of where we're going. Our planning has been quite ad hoc, like Variation 2 was our scramble because we were suddenly classified as from a low growth to a medium growth centre. And it's no fault of councils. I just think that council has to, it's an issue, isn't it? Council has to rely on data that comes by way of census and that kind of thing. And there's always a lag in that data. It's always slightly out of date because it's only ever done every now and again. Whereas I suppose developers are working on, and people like myself and surveyors, we're working on kind of at the coalface where you've got other indicators coming through. So you'll get someone will approach you because they're getting a lot of inquiry about their land, or real estate agents saying, we've got a lot of inquiry for this, we can't satisfy in this area, is there any ability to get any more? And that sort of information, because it's anecdotal, harder to, I suppose, make it objective from council's perspective, means that I think sometimes from maybe that side of things, council's approaches appear a little bit lagging. this is a real opportunity to kind of be ambitious, because inclusion of land within the FDS doesn't mean that council is going to necessarily that it'll flow down through to a district plan change. You're going to have to get over a few hurdles to do that. Secondly, it doesn't commit council to any particular infrastructure upgrades. So what it does do in FDS is it says here's a broad location that we could potentially grow into. We note that there's this infrastructure that's required for that growth, and that there's these constraints in terms of that development. So whatever those constraints are, and with Dunedin, a lot of it's going to do with topography and flooding and landslide risks and et cetera, all those kind of things that we're all well aware of. And so that's why I think that it should be ambitious and kind of give a real clear steer to here's some areas that we could grow into. We all know there's issues with them. Let's, indicate them, and then that allows people, as I've said last week, in terms of the industrial land, that allows landowners and other parties, interested parties, to go away and begin some investigation. And also allows the opportunity for, if there's enough of an area, it also provides opportunity for, in a district plan change, before we get through to that point, for a particular interested party or developer to actually have discussions with council about other funding mechanisms for whatever infrastructure upgrades are required, so that going forward it's not necessarily just council that's going to be paying for those in their entirety.
With regard to South Dunedin, how would you see housing development being supported or not?
So South Dunedin's particularly difficult, and I think it's, without being extremist, quite alarming if you've got probably one of the bigger intensification developers in that area, and a couple of others have now sort of started to follow suit, saying that there's real issues with insurance in that area. That then leaves intensification developments to more your Joe Bloggs that might have, they've got some property there that they've owned for a period of time, and they might slowly do bits by bits, but that's not going to provide the housing capacity that council's relying on in its HCA. So our housing capacity and the future growth for our city relies on a lot of two up, two down, is what I call them. So a lot of townhouses, probably in Dunedin, are only going to be a couple of stories high, maybe 3 at the most, because the costs we can't yield if they get too much higher, we can't yield the price that people need to for developers to be able to afford those developments. If we go on the HCA with an ageing population, stairs are difficult for elderly people, so probably not what we want in that. Not a problem for younger people, younger families, so much potentially. But again, that's if we're relying on just intensification, then that's really only one housing type in several locations, albeit, but it's one type of housing, and that's not what the NPDS UD requires. It requires a variety of housing choice, so housing types, standalone and attached.
And this question goes to the purpose of the FDS as it rolls out of the MPS UD, and starting with the premise that housing development is enabled, previous submitters have indicated that Dunedin buyers tend to buy a single dwelling and then stay in it all their lives. If the FDS provides for housing opportunities that enable residents to relocate within the city depending on their life stage, would this not then allow for a range of housing types to become available to the market across the city over time? And how would you see this meeting the future housing expectations as you described?
Those are really good questions. So I think firstly my concern is if Somerset, and I understand they're going to provide some more figures about the quantity of land, but if Somerset are talking about the quantities of land that they see Dunedin needs for ageing populations, we can't supply it at the moment. we can't supply it. So there's not enough for that segment of the population. Also, retirement villages tend to be single-level dwellings. Where there are apartment buildings, there's lifts. So lifts are relatively expensive. I've got a couple of intensification, I suppose you would call them, resource consents that have been issued that have lifts in them, and you really have to punch towards, so they're attached townhouse units, 3 levels, bottom level having a garage, maybe another room used for something else, but you really have to punch well above the average asking price in Dunedin to be able to afford lifts, because they are shared between 2 buildings. Or they're incredibly small, so they are kind of 1 metre by 1 metre, so a large shower or medium-sized shower. So I can't see that happening in South Dunedin. I don't think that they would achieve those kind of prices. Where those prices are being, it's more likely to be up on our more affluent hill suburbs. And maybe some of the nicer parts of the inner city residential zones, around the town bound again on the hills. Yes, as we lose single homes and we go into townhouses, that will force people to move into townhouses more and more. But again, that's going to affect the character of our city as well. So as we lose large parts of our inner and outer suburbs to intensification, we're going to lose a lot of our tree cover. Even with the Variation 2 landscaping rules, we're going to lose more than what we gain. That's just the nature of development. You can't put townhouses in to mature gardens and expect to retain trees and that sort of thing. So the character of our city will change. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it needs to be acknowledged. As far as people moving, Dunedinites love their, so my experience of, I think I've been in my business over 20 years in Dunedin now, Dunedinites love their part of Dunedin, and they're very staunch advocates of their part of Dunedin, and I think you're probably right that there's many people that do live the majority of their lives in one area of Dunedin. So that really just, I think then at that point you're back at that same thing that you need to provide the room for the city to grow, so that you've got the different types of housings within each of those different areas that people love. And intensification is only one type of housing type. Yeah. Hopefully I've answered all of your questions.
Thanks, Peters. I'm just interested, you brought this economic argument before in the past about the cost of building and supply of land. But if there was a significant undersupply, then would you not expect on the market and supply and demand to affect the price, and we would have seen an unreasonable increase in house prices in Dunedin, which we really haven't seen?
So there's probably 2 answers to that. So one is, some people would say that we have got an unreasonable price point in Dunedin, and the reason that we don't go any higher is because people that would otherwise be shifting to Dunedin choose to shift to Christchurch. So their price point for brand new dwellings, townhouses and detached, tends to be a lot lower than what we are in Dunedin. They're also rapidly, through district plan changes, as well as I understand what their future development strategy will be, but even through district plan changes, they are releasing a lot more land than what Dunedin has or will be. And I think also that, and maybe it comes down to the point that was raised by your colleague, that Dunedinites do tend to live in one place for a long time, so potential areas for intensification, particularly in various suburbs, particularly maybe the nicer suburbs, don't come along that often. To do a real intensification, if you're want to do more than sort of 3 or 4, you really need to buy up several properties. So you've got to have willing sellers to be able to obtain those. Intensification, so the difference between, say, the submission site and intensification within Mosgiel or other suburbs within Dunedin, topography obviously increases your build costs. You've got to, although it's not a requirement, but most of the ones that come across my desk certainly include some level of access, especially if they're going for the higher end. There will be car access. So to get car access on topography, you've got increased design and build costs to do with foundations on topography. South Dunedin poses its own kind of design challenges. So I think that's why we need a balance of intensification and greenfield. And you don't have as many costs. You're not having to demolish, not having to clear sites, you're not having to wait while you buy up a certain amount of land around whatever site.
We then have to provide 3 water services and transport services to those greenfield sites, so it's not without a cost to the city. Just before I carry on though, so you did mention that most of your examples are anecdotal. Do you have anything that's not anecdotal that can sit with this statement that you seem to be coming with a statement that we have undersupplied and underestimated demand? So what's the evidence you have for that?
So just a couple of things picking up on then. You've said the cost to the city for infrastructure. So that's always acknowledged that with any development, be that intensification or greenfield, there's cost to the city in terms of needing to do infrastructure projects. The subject site at the moment has obviously good roading infrastructure, and there will be 3 waters infrastructure upgrades that are required. But if it's included in the FDS, then that provides, and there's sufficient area included in the FDS, then that provides opportunity for interested parties to start discussions with council about what would be required and how funding of that might look. So I don't think the burden would necessarily be completely upon council. With respect to the anecdotal evidence in terms of demand and supply, you'll be aware that that I undertook Lagoima requests, and we've recently been provided the data for not the assumptions, but the list of properties between, I think it was 6 or might have been 5 and 50 that could provide that kind of development capacity, and work is currently been undertaken to work our way through each of those line by line to work out from a desk point analysis what the unders and overs situation is with the model. Previously, variation 2, and there was a lot of evidence provided by various real estate agents. So I think they're the experts in terms of what they're encountering on a day-to-day basis in terms of demand. So people interested in purchasing property in Dunedin or various locations within Dunedin, and I think that they're your best coalface experts to provide that, and certainly happy to go and update that evidence. I know there was evidence given for various sites, including part of this one for variation 2. Yes, so that's probably all that I can offer at this stage.
If I look at the FDS and the map of figure 26 at the existing greenfield sites, they're quite, or even the existing residential transition overlay zones, there seems to be quite a lot of them. Now, I just want to tease out, if this sort of land was made available as you're suggesting, what does that then do to the price? I mean, so you've got a whole lot of sites you're suggesting. What does that then do to the price on the market anyway, and actually disincentivise it for developers and their risk?
Yeah, So that's a good question. And I think that comes down to maybe the difference between the two documents. So the land included in the FDS is not zoned. So it's not rezoned urban of any form. It is just an indication of where the development can potentially go, noting the constraints and the infrastructure upgrades that would be required. Then there would have to be a district plan change to move it from the FDS into the district plan, and obviously would need to go through that process that you're very familiar with. With respect to the land that's already been zoned, the majority of the zoned greenfields land in Mosgiel is included in the housing capacity assessment as meeting demand within Mosgiel, but also that overflow demand of intensification in Dunedin doesn't meet the required figures. Mosgiel is expected to pick up the slack, so to speak. So that's, and I've referenced the parts of the HCA that says that in my evidence. So I think that what we'll find is that once those greenfield developments make it through the resource, the design, the resource consent process, and therefore onto the market, they'll be like the other ones around Mosgiel that went reasonably quickly. I note that one of the RTZ area, so the southeast Mosgiel RTZ area, I'm involved in that, seeking the release of part of that, but the great majority of the part that we're seeking a release for is the land owned by Somerset, so we'll go for a retirement village, and therefore isn't actually housing capacity that's available to others, other segments of the market. If it was all, so, and I think this is, maybe it's of course it's a concern to developers, and it's a concern that we want them to be profitable so that they do provide more housing capacity. But I suppose that's an ideological kind of point of view, whether council should be the arbitrator of whether or not there is enough supply. So does council actually have the ability to be able to gauge all the factors to know whether or not there's sufficient supply, or should it just be looking after its own knitting in terms of infrastructure, and then allowing more areas that that can be identified for future growth that then can work their way through all the myriad of issues. I think the other thing that we've got too that kind of relates into that is we've got a set of moving goalposts. So, and the council staff will be, or maybe one of you, the panel members will be able to correct me. I think our current housing capacity assessment, our short term, so the 3 years, runs out next year, and any demand that's not met is, so we're always moving forward. So after that, we're supposed to have had some medium term stuff, so we're always going to be moving forward. And at the moment, we've got various issues on land that's seeking either release or seeking resource consent. So Wells Plant land is a good one that ORC will be well familiar with, in terms of it's had some issues trying to even start on its resource consent process or get through that because of various things that are happening there. So it takes time, and so I think that's my big concern, is it takes time for everything to move through. So one of Dunedin's biggest kind of developers to date in terms of greenfield to houses, he does greenfield plus putting up the houses. He reckons the fastest that he could do it if all stars aligned is maybe 3 to 4 years. So that's, you've got the land, you get your consent, your resource consent, do your subdivisional works, you get your building consent, you build, you turn a key. But he said in most of his it would be 5 to 7 years. So it's that lag.
Sorry, I just want to turn the question around then, and I'll probably ask the two questions this and not for later, is given that how frequently the FDS has to be reviewed and updated, the issues that you're raising, given the timeframes you've talked about and the amount of land already available and the time frames for that to come on, doesn't that mean that this is premature to consider this land in the FDS now, and that you've got plenty of opportunities should that growth happen or should that demand be there, that actually it's premature at the moment? And that is
exactly how you can look at it, and that is indeed how the FDS does, like the council staff and the report itself looks at it. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. 6 years, you have to obviously do a new future development strategy, and every 3 years there's a refresh. So a refresh, I'm not sure what a refresh is. I don't know what that process looks like. This is obviously a new process. So does a refresh look like council? What does that mean? Does council suddenly decide that actually it might have got some of its figures wrong in the previous, 3 years ago, and so now it does want to include some? How does it go about that? Does it ask people? Does it have a list from previous things that people have put forward? Maybe those people they're not interested now. Things have changed. People have moved on. I think that's why I think I'd like to have something ambitious that actually says, well, here's something for the next 30 years. This is where we could go, Dunedin. And then that allows for people to begin on all of, because it's time. So the release of the RTZ is probably going to take a couple of years. And that's not even before you get to resource consenting. Wells Plant Land's been, I think, their resource consenting issues so far has taken over 12 months. I mean, we're not even at building consent, we're not at subdivisional works, we're not actually doing anything, we're just doing the paperwork. So I think that's why it needs to be ambitious, because you need to allow people the opportunity for them at their own cost, not councils, at their own cost, to go and start those preliminary investigations that could mean that we've got some really fantastic opportunities in the future for some rezoning of land. Council's in complete control of that. Council doesn't have to accept anything down through if it doesn't think that all the issues have been dealt with in terms of infrastructure, constraints on land. It doesn't have to accept a request for a district plan change.
I've just got some different questions for you, and don't take these questions as any kind of sign of disrespect, but I haven't come across you before as a witness, and I was interested in your evidence. You've agreed to comply with the Code of Conduct for expert witnesses, even though this is not an RMA hearing. So I was just wondering, and what was your BA in? What was your major in your BA?
Yeah, so I did, my BA, my first class honours degree, and my masters in psychology were in psychology, and then I did a law degree. So I did planning and environment and various things, as well as commercial and family law in my legal degree. And then I went overseas and worked as a lawyer, and that was in Australia. And I worked in Melbourne as a commercial lawyer, but also I did a lot in the environmental realm over there with various big corporations. So that was really interesting work. And then worked in Sydney for Stockland Property Trust, was a crossover legal procurement role. So Stockland Property Trust are one of the bigger developers of commercial, residential and industrial land in Australia, and also they have like malls and other things like that. And then I came back to New Zealand, and that was in 2003. That's when I set up my consultancy business, and I've been doing the planning consultancy business since then.
Yeah, that was a long answer. I only asked you what your MA and your BA were in.
Oh, well, I thought it best to kind of let you know. I mean, I have no problems about anybody knowing about that. It's all available information.
Just wait for the questions. So your MA and your BA were in psychology. You've obviously got an LLB.
Yes.
Are you a member of New Zealand Planning Institute?
No, I'm not. No, I've never have been. No.
Okay. All right, now thanks for that. But no further questions or clarification from me. I found your evidence clear. I understood what you're saying to us, so thank you. Shall we move on to the next submitter, I think, which is Wendy Campbell. Now, without wanting to hurry you along, I think you've been allocated 20 minutes for each of the 4 submitters. And no criticism, but we've used up 45 minutes on the first one, so I'm assuming that the next 3 will be briefer, because we won't need to traverse those kind of big picture issues, will we? We'll just focus on the specifics.
Yes, that's fine. And I'd just like to say, look, I do apologise. I did have a rather faulty template for the thing, so, it does say before a panel appointed by the DCC. I think the last 2 I got it right, that it was the ORC, and obviously disagreed it wasn't under the RMA. I kept the expert witness statement because I think it's a good thing to have in there. So, Wendy Campbell. So again, this is another broad location. It involves 5 properties, some of which are, have a variation to appeal, as you've noted previously. The extent is approximately 550 hectares, the majority of which is owned or controlled by Wendy Campbell. I think it's about 524 hectares. So this one here does actually provide some real scope in terms of the topography of the land, providing for different locations and types of housing. There's some real known constraints in terms of both infrastructure but also the land itself, and probably allowing for 40 to 50% of the land, with the constraints and also the normal kind of stormwater infrastructure access and all that kind of thing. You're probably looking in the vicinity of somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 homes across this whole entire submission site. I think the beauty about this submission site is that it actually provides some real opportunity for long-term biodiversity gain and recreational gains. So Wendy's vision, certainly for her land, which is the majority of the small sloping topography, it does involve some flatter areas as well, is that there would be recreational and biodiversity gains that take care of those constraints on the land. And as part of the Variation 2 process, there was a structure plan done for part of it, and that's appended to the submissions, which shows some of those constraints. As part of the Variation 2 submissions, there was some investigation of the main constraint, which is transportation with North Torrey Road, and it was found that it was feasible to be able to, in terms of both the works and the cost, to develop Abbots Hill Road, and that would be not for a cost for council, that would be a cost for land owners that developed. There's also major infrastructure, Three Waters infrastructure going through the site. So we've got the main lead from Mount Grand Water Station water treatment plant that comes down through to a tank within land owned by Wendy Campbell. And again, this site, although being LUC land, is LUC 3, so and sits definitely between adjacent to and between various parts of the city. I know that on Wendy's behalf, she's obviously getting on in years and would really like to see this land. She wants a plan going forward for it, and hence the wanting to have her whole property included in the FDS, so that there is then the opportunity for her to go forward and start some of the investigations and put on paper her ideas for how the land should progress. She's owned this land for quite a number of decades. And again, I just think that the various infrastructure constraints aren't a barrier for this property being included within the FDS, and this is absolutely a site that would be exciting in terms of Dunedin's potential future growth.
Thank you for that. Now, to see if we have any what I might call site-specific questions. I think we had a good discussion on the higher order kind of issues with the HCA and the NPSUD. So, Kate, any site-specific? No. Jim? How are you?
No, I'm good,
No.
thanks.
Sherry? No. And no, look, neither do I, and all that means is your evidence is clearly written and we've understood it, so don't take that as a bad sign. So now we move on to Ross McCleary.
Okay, so this particular site is a variation 2 appeal site, and so I think overall there's about 76 hectares involved in this, which allowing for a range of densities, probably at the larger site size, you're probably looking 240 sort of to 300 and something sites across the houses across the whole site. So this is I think another submission site that is providing exciting opportunities for a different location in Dunedin. Again, it's one that the constraints in terms of the land with the gullies and that sort of thing provide exciting opportunities for biodiversity gain, as well as recreation opportunities. And the land involved also would provide for a range of or could provide for a range of residential densities and housing types. It also provides for, if it was included in the FDS, an indication of where Brighton could grow to. There's not much opportunity in terms of Brighton for its growth, other than again intensification, and we've already kind of traversed the potential issues with intensification in terms of its cost of development and only providing for one type of housing. This is a site that I think where so Dunedin City Council probably really needs to identify some more land for greenfield development within Brighton or adjacent to Brighton, like this site, and that's because we're currently at the moment losing opportunities to Clutha District Council in terms of the development down at Tyree Beach. And so over the last period of time, there's been quite a bit of development go on down at Tyree Beach, and there's more in the pipeline for down there. And there would be a number of people that live at Tyree Beach that would commute to various parts of Dunedin or the Tyree for work. And it would be, I think it's a shame that DCC is actually losing out on that development potential and ratepayer potential. And the reason that people are going to Tyree Beach is because it's greenfield development, and also the land is basically flat. So within this particular submission site, there are steeper areas, but there's also spur areas that provide good broad spurs that provide gently sloping land. Yeah, I think that's about it for that one.
Thank you for that. Andrew, any questions? Sherry? Alani?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Jim? No. Okay. No, it looks like we don't have any questions on that one either. Thank you. And so the last one, just panel members note, is a change to the schedule. So instead of Meets New Zealand, we're now hearing from on behalf of DDS Properties 2008.
Okay, so the location of the DDS Properties 2008 Limited is submission site is included in Appendix 1A of the evidence and Figure 1 of DDS's submission. And so obviously that land at the moment is zoned rural, and then there's also some land at 4 and 18 Stack Street that's used for commercial purposes. And attached to the submission was the Riverview structure plan. So that provided the kind of view of what potentially development could look like, and the various areas that were going to go into that. So you'll see in there that there is areas that are set aside for stormwater management and biodiversity gain, recreation opportunity, and various density of housing. This is part of the site where the structure plan is, apart from the two smaller properties on Stack Street where they are subject of a variation to appeal. And in the variation 2 decision, the hearings panel in there noted that that the ideal place for this particular proposal was in the FDS. It's acknowledged that there's various infrastructure in terms of three waters constraints from city's perspective, but this particular proposal, there was some preliminary investigations went into looking at providing either individual on-site wastewater management or a communal on-site wastewater system that would disperse within the site. So we'd set aside part of that into a through some various treatment modes and into a man-made wetland, not affecting any of the existing wetland areas. This site sits between two major transportation infrastructure. So we've got the state highway network, and we've also got the main trunk railway line, which provides real opportunity in the future for public transport, one way or the other. And again, some preliminary investigations were undertaken in terms of a commuter rail car from maybe even Milton through to Dunedin, and that is viable and could be done, particularly if these developments around Ellington and a few other places were undertaken. We just have in Dunedin an issue with the Caversham tunnel that needs to be resolved for, it's to do with the length of it and passenger cars. However, I do note that there's other passenger cars that go through it. But so there's some technical issues there. But anyway, there is also obviously the ability to have buses and that kind of thing, which tend to follow population growth. There's obviously potable water out in this area is currently is rainwater collection, and so either that could continue or there would need to be some sort of solution to the provision of water to Ellington. But that is really, that's the kind of thing that if this was included in the FDS then allows interested parties to begin that work. So one of the interesting things about Ellington is because it has that wastewater, reticulated wastewater, intensification can happen in Ellington, although there's some issues with intensification within Ellington just due to its topography and where houses are currently sitting, shaded kind of slopes, hill slopes, and there's also a large reserve area within Ellington, and there's also some points that are, can be prone to flooding as well. So the other point with intensification is in Ellington again is that if you're expecting requiring a high yield and potentially higher prices, Ellington historically has always been at a lower price point than kind of its counterparts around the Taieri, thinking Outram or Mosgiel. And so intensification to provide for demand within Ellington itself may not be a particular solution. In any event, I think the NPS UD is clear from that it requires both greenfield and intensification. And again, similar to Brighton actually, currently Dunedin City's losing residents to Waihola. So there's been a lot of development within Waihola itself, which is just down the road, and even to Milton. So particularly Milton being has historically been a lower price point than Ellington, so people that are wanting to get into the housing market and needing lower prices. So I think that represents a lost opportunity for Dunedin City Council. I think that's about all I want to say on that one there. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see if we have questions for you on DDS properties. Andrew?
I'm going to revert to a common theme through these submissions with your approval, Mr. Chair. But you talked about sufficient development capacity with your first submission. And I suppose I'm just trying to put my hat on or your shoes on or whatever. But what advice have you got for the panel? Because sufficient capacity can mean different things to different people, but it seems like it's trying to find that middle ground where it sort of satisfies a degree of demand, but doesn't over-satisfy. So not too much, not too little, but it's somewhere in between. So is there any further advice you can share with us?
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. That comes back to that ideological point that I was talking about before, and whether it is actually up to council to say whether there is enough capacity. So is there a point at which council should be saying we've got enough capacity? So the anecdotal evidence that I have is that there is demand in places like Ellington, but it doesn't show up in the figures because there's not land for sale. Same with this would be true of other areas like Outram and even Warrington and Doctors Point and various other settlement or township areas. So there is demand, and that's experienced by sometimes landowners, but also real estate agents with the rate of inquiries that they get within certain areas. That won't show up in any official figures because, for it to show up, you would have to have a willing landowner selling or developing. I really think that the FDS, and that's why I call it an ambitious document, it should really just say these are the opportunities that we have. This is potentially somewhere that, in this case, Ellington could grow into. We've got a submission that is including business land as well. So currently within Variation 2 in the district plan, there's no provision for business land and to support the even just the intensification that could happen under Variation 2 rules. So I would like to see it kind of identify areas, broad areas that you could move into if all of these other issues can be dealt with. But we need that. The FDS needs to indicate it spatially. You know, here's some areas, and then that allows interested parties to go away and commence the investigations and engage the various consultants that need to be engaged to look at the various issues, begin discussions with council once they've undertaken some of those investigations to see what potential solutions there might be, or, you know, indeed it may be that actually there's, you know, we don't have a solution. So, but I don't think council's in a position, either council, to be able to say that there aren't solutions at the moment because those investigations haven't taken place. Some investigations might have. In fact, I don't think for Ellington itself that there are Three Waters investigations that have been undertaken. I think that one of the documents says that there's been no investigations. So, yeah.
I don't want to make the assumption of rates for rate's sake, but when you're talking about housing or development outside of the DCC area, what do you mean by lost opportunity?
So we've had, if people want to live, for example, on the south coast, and but they can't find something that meets their need at the time that they want to buy, then they will look somewhere else in a similar type of location. So for Brighton, it tends to be Tyree Beach. For Ellington, it tends to be Waihola or even further south to Milton. And that's because there's similar kind of price points in the market. And so those people that are often, they're still involved with Dunedin one way or the other. They may be travelling to, for example, to Mosgiel or other jobs within the Tyree, or indeed into Dunedin. They're still coming to Dunedin, but we've lost, in terms of City Council, it's lost the rates opportunity of those people. So if we think about greenfield development, and we think about the costs of greenfield development, the costs of greenfield development in terms of infrastructure within the development are borne by the developer. There's usually upgrades to, depending on the size of the development, but the larger development, there's normally upgrades to Three Waters and transportation infrastructure that's a result, that's directly applicable to the development of that area. Council, and then on top of that, obviously there's going to be DCs, so development contributions, sorry, shouldn't be using jargon, and then you've obviously got the increase in rating base going forward, which includes a component of that rating base going forward is your maintenance of your infrastructure, new infrastructure that's just been put in. Most developments have a requirement that the infrastructure is looked after by the developer for a period of time, so that's usually around the 5 years that they have to maintain it, or they have to ensure that there's a contract to maintain it, and that's part of the handing over or the vesting of that infrastructure to council. So yes, there can be, and I'm not saying there's not, there's definitely infrastructure upgrades that will be a cost to DCC, and so DCC and indeed even ORC if you're talking about stormwater management. And so those things need to be carefully considered. And that is part of, obviously that's something that can be considered at the time of the future development strategy, but I don't think that the full picture is before council at the time of future development strategy. That full picture comes out before something would be accepted for a district plan change.
Mine's Ellington specific, and it's actually for staff, if I can ask that. They talk in the future development strategy about not having capacity, just saying that waste water is serviced there and pumped to Mosgiel. And I think Mosgiel does have an issue, and I think I know a wee bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing because I used to be chair of infrastructure as well. And my understanding was that was pumped because there was a real problem with overflows and soil types in that area, but the capacity wasn't necessarily there for any more extensions, and I'd be really keen to understand if the same system still exists. It was basically still using septic tanks but then being pumped and ulied up And I'm not quite sure if that has changed, and I'd be grateful to understand, because it may have, just to understand any future constraints. Thank you.
Right, sorry, I thought there was a question from Ms Peters. That's for the staff.
Yeah, I think the staff are in a better position to say that.
Okay.
Just bearing in mind that there's been preliminary investigations for the DDS property site about having a communal wastewater system that is dealt with on site and dispersal on site. So there's some really clever systems up and down the countryside that do that in very sensitive locations. So Jack's Point has one in Queenstown. Yeah.
So, Ms Peters, just two questions from me on this particular submission. You did reminded us that the variation to hearings panel had said that this might be more appropriately considered through the FDS, and that's also mentioned in Appendix 2 of the officer's recommendation report on page 5. But just for my benefit, because I'm not a local, when were the decisions on variation 2 released? Can you remember, roughly?
I'm going to look to my colleague to my right. Yeah.
23? Yes, beginning of last year on the Greenfield rezoning.
So the decision on this particular property, DDS properties, would that decision have been released at the start of 2003? Right?
2023, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, okay. Do you know for sure, Jim, you on that panel?
That's why I didn't really have to ask many more questions. I also think that when that panel recommended it go to the FDS, we weren't particularly sure exactly what the FDS activity was either, for that matter.
Yeah, I was just interested in terms of timing of that panel's recommendation, and then the FDS obviously has been developed since then, so their indication that the FDS should deal with it, I'm assuming the FDS, that its preparation has dealt with that issue.
I assume so.
Yeah, that was the basis of my question. Now, in your verbal presentation, you talked about business land. I just got a little bit confused there. This submission only sought Greenfield's residential land. So where were you going with the business land comment?
So that's the rural centre. So the rural centre is business land. So that's on the structure plan that is the Riverview structure plan that's appended to the submission. That's the pink 9 and the 1 and 8. And it goes into some detail on the legend for that about what that could potentially involve. So but essentially this submission, it seeks to kind of take Ellington from a settlement to a rural centre. So it's providing for the growth and resilience of Ellington in line with the, because you've got in the 2GP, you've got all your objectives and policies relating to growth and resilience of our settlement and township areas.
Oh yeah, so where in your evidence do you talk about that?
So there is paragraphs.
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
Remind me.
Let's find that. Let's see if I've got it on the note. This is where you really want to have your being able to go rural centre. Right, so paragraph 30, it really is talking about that. So just taking it from a smaller residential settlement without a commercial centre to a township with a centre.
Yeah, okay.
And just the fact that there's the different kind of, I suppose within the district plan, there's the balance needs to be struck between managing urban expansion, but also providing for the growth and resilience of our townships and settlements, and that also should be reflected within the FDS. So in some ways, they're kind of like if you think of compact city, that's I suppose almost for places like Ellington and Outram and Brighton and Middlemarch, that compact city policy objective kind of thing is almost in direct opposition to our resilient and township and settlements objectives and policies.
Yep. All right, no, thanks for clarifying that for me. So I think that brings us to the end of our questions for you this afternoon, but we're seeing you again tomorrow at 1:30, so we look forward to seeing you then. So that brings us to the end of today's submitters. I think, officers, we don't think we've posed many questions to you today, have we? I'll just check with the panel. Is there any other matter arising from today's submissions that you'd like the officers to address in the end of hearing report? You let that bubble away and then you can enunciate that tomorrow. How's that? Yeah. Sherry? Jim?
Just in terms of the inland port, whether or not we should be considering freight movements that are outside the footprint of the city when we're looking at whether or not there's other opportunities for any other activities that relate to our outcomes. They're not in the city, which obviously is the Millburn, is what I'm talking about, but logs that are coming from outside the city, they're trying to go to the city, through the city, therefore we're affected by them, but they come from a distant site. Some commentary on how we can deal with assessing that and whether it relates to the scope of the FDS, because does the scope just stay inside the Dunedin city's footprint?
I don't think I think Tauranga would say it's a port.
Yeah, I think it goes beyond. That's why we have the Regional Transport Committee. But
thank you very much. So with that, we're adjourned now until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. And just panel to note, so there's been a swap out. So at 1:30 we're hearing Ms Peters on behalf of Meets New Zealand. And just checking, Jenny, is Karen Anderson still appearing at the end of tomorrow? Okay. All right, thanks very much. We'll see you all tomorrow morning.
And I'll just close us with a karakia then, Rob. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa te atawhai tātou ariki, e hukaraiti me te aroha me te atoa, me te whiwhi nā taitanga, e te wairua tapu, aki aki, amenei.